Hey there. Welcome back to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're stepping into the streets of Harlem in the 1920s, a time of jazz, poetry, and the Harlem Renaissance, but also a time when the underworld had its own crown. And at the very top was a woman unlike any other. Her name was Stephanie St. Clair. To some, she was Madame St. Clair. To others, the Queen of Harlem. She built an empire in a man's world, defied the Mafia, fought corrupt cops, and left behind a legend that still echoes through Harlem streets. But how did a young woman from the island of Martinique rise to rule one of the toughest games in New York? And how did she hold her ground when the infamous Dutch Schultz and the Mafia itself came knocking? Stick with me, and we'll find out. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let me know, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it where you are? It's always wild seeing this little community of ours stretch across so many time zones. And if you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and tap the bell too, so you don't miss the next dive into the darker corners of history. All right, let the noise of the day fade out. Settle in and follow me into Harlem shadows. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1, Harlem's Crowned Queen. The night was restless, and Harlem was holding its breath. Somewhere in the smoke-filled backrooms of Lenox Avenue, whispers traveled faster than the jazz notes pouring out of the clubs. They said the Mafia was coming north. They said Dutch Schultz, the Bronx beer baron, had his eyes on Harlem. And they said there was one woman, just one, who stood between him and total control. Stephanie St. Clair, Madame St. Clair, the Harlem Queen. Picture her for a moment, not as a faded name in the pages of history, but as a living presence in the late 1920s. Sharp eyes that saw through lies, dresses stitched with the confidence of wealth, a mind honed sharper than any blade. When Schultz's men crept into Harlem, buying cops, intimidating bankers, breaking bones in alleyways, she didn't hide. She didn't kneel. She laughed. And then she declared war. But that battle, her defiance against the Mafia, didn't come out of nowhere. It was the climax of a Harlem story already in motion. A story of migration, of dreams, of music, of sweat, and of shadows. To understand the Queen, you must first understand the kingdom she ruled. So let's step back. Let's walk these streets as they were a century ago. Harlem in the 1920s was alive. The Great Migration had brought thousands of black families north, escaping the weight of Southern chains and searching for a chance at dignity. The avenues swelled with people, the air laced with the perfume of hot bread, perfume from corner shops, and the smoky bite of street vendors' grills. And at night, Harlem lit up, not just with street lamps, but with voices and trumpets, poetry spilling out of brownstones, and clubs alive with Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway. Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was the beating heart of a movement, a renaissance of art and intellect that announced to the world, we are here. But Harlem was also a battlefield. Opportunity and exploitation walked hand in hand. With the legal doors of banking closed to so many, the people created their own system, their own chance to bet on fortune, the numbers game. Think of it as a community lottery, small wagers placed on three-digit numbers, drawn daily. For the working poor, it was more than gambling. It was hope, a shot at rent money, at groceries, at dignity. And in Harlem, the numbers racket became its own shadow economy, thriving where Wall Street never looked. This is where Stephanie St. Clair found her power. Imagine her stepping into this world for the first time. An immigrant from Martinique, carrying the lessons of hardship and ambition carved into her bones. She had seen poverty. She had tasted hunger. But she refused to wear defeat. Where others saw chance, she saw structure. Where others saw chaos, she saw empire. And Harlem, bursting with life and risk, gave her the canvas she needed. The numbers game might sound like just a hustle, but it required precision. Collectors, writers, runners, all working in rhythm, like a symphony of hidden transactions. And to rise in it, you needed more than muscle. You needed vision, discipline, and the will to bend fear into loyalty. Stephanie mastered it all. Her banking operation grew sleek and efficient, trusted by the community because she played fair. When others skimmed, she paid in full. When others bullied, she charmed. And when rivals tried to cheat her, she struck back with a ruthless edge that made people whisper her name with both respect and caution. Soon, Harlem crowned her as its queen. But this crown wasn't made of jewels. It was made of survival. She wore it because no man dared to take it. In a world where women were expected to bow, she built an empire that forced men to look up. And she didn't just run it quietly. She lived loudly, draped in furs, adorned in jewels. Her presence felt in every club and every paper. She wasn't just a crime boss. She was Harlem royalty, and she wanted the world to know. Still, the streets were never gentle. Beneath the music and laughter, Harlem carried scars. Police officers preyed on its people, demanding bribes, shaking down small-time operators, brutalizing anyone who resisted. But Madame St. Clair did not bow to their badges. She fought back with words sharper than any knife. In full-page ads in Harlem newspapers, she called out corruption, naming names, exposing the system. It was a move no one dared before. A woman, an immigrant, a crime boss, publicly humiliating the police. Harlem buzzed with disbelief, but also pride. She became more than a banker. She became a voice of defiance. And that defiance carried weight, because power in Harlem wasn't just about numbers. It was about respect. And Madame St. Clair understood something most of her rivals never grasped. Respect cannot be bought. It must be earned. Every payout she honored, every cop she challenged, every rival she silenced, built the legend of the Harlem Queen. Yet legends attract enemies. And soon, her kingdom will be tested by a storm that didn't care about Harlem's pride or renaissance. The Italian mob saw Harlem not as a cultural beacon, but as territory. Money. Numbers were profits, and profits belonged to them, or so they thought. Dutch Schultz, violent and unpredictable, sharpened his teeth for Harlem. And Stephanie St. Clair, standing in her fur coats and diamonds, would not step aside. Picture the scene. Harlem at night, headlights gliding down Lenox, the low hum of clubs spilling into the street. Somewhere in those shadows, Schultz's men lurked, watching, waiting, marking territory. And somewhere else, in an office that smelled of ink and ambition, Stephanie St. Clair was plotting. She knew war was coming. She knew Harlem was at stake. And she knew one truth that kept her fearless. When you build an empire on respect, you do not surrender it to fear. But even queens bleed, and Harlem would soon learn how much blood it would take to keep its crown. For now, we leave her there, draped in confidence, her empire humming, Harlem alive under her watch, the queen at her peak. But history doesn't freeze at peaks. It tilts, it trembles, it falls. And the forces circling Stephanie St. Clair would stop at nothing to take what she built. The question is not whether they came for her. The question is, how long could she hold them off? Chapter 2. Born in Martinique. The Queen of Harlem was not born with a crown. She was born on an island where the sea was both a gift and a prison. Before the fur coats and diamonds, before the newspaper ads and gang wars, there was a little girl in Martinique, barefoot, stubborn, and already unwilling to bow. Picture this. The late 19th century, the Caribbean sun so hot it burned the skin, the air thick with salt and sugar cane. The island was French in law, but not in spirit. Martinique carried scars of slavery, its soil soaked with the sweat of people who had worked the plantations long before freedom came. That freedom, when it finally arrived, didn't mean equality. Poverty clung to the black families of the island like a second skin. Children grew up fast. Dreams were luxuries. And every day was a negotiation with hunger. Into this world came Stephanie. We know the year, 1886. A small fishing village cradled her first cries. Her father gone, her mother struggling, she entered life already marked by absence. And yet, there was something about her, even as a child. She refused to be small. She refused to be silent. When other children lowered their heads, she lifted hers. When others accepted scraps, she demanded more. Her mother worked tirelessly, mending clothes, cooking, doing whatever she could to keep food on the table. But poverty is a relentless creditor. No matter how much you give, it always asks for more. Stephanie grew up with an intimate knowledge of want. She knew the hollow ache in her stomach, the sting of going without shoes, the humiliation of watching wealth pass her by. But instead of crushing her, those moments became fuel. Each hunger pang was a vow. One day, I will not live like this. In the Caribbean, girls were expected to blend into the background. Their futures mapped out before they could even speak them aloud. Work, marriage, children, and silence. Stephanie resisted. She devoured books, craved education, absorbed French language and culture with the hunger of someone who knew knowledge was currency. While other children played in the fields, she studied. She trained her mind the way soldiers train their bodies. Every page she turned was a weapon. Every word she learned was a shield. But Martinique was not forgiving to ambition, especially not to a poor black girl. Doors stayed closed. Paths stayed narrow. The island, for all its beauty, was a cage. You could see the ocean every day, but freedom was always on the other side of it. For many, that cage became their whole world. For Stephanie, it was a challenge. She looked at that horizon and thought, I will not die here. There are stories, fragments of memory, that suggest she was defiant even with authority. Teachers found her too bold. Neighbors whispered that she had ideas above her station. But what is a queen if not someone who refuses the role written for her? Even as a teenager, Stephanie carried herself with a kind of dignity that poverty could not strip away. She learned early that respect was not handed out. It was taken, demanded, insisted upon. And then came the decision that would change everything. Sometime in her early 20s, she chose exile. It was not exile in chains, but in choice. To leave Martinique was to abandon familiarity, family, and the land that had shaped her. But it was also to reject limits. She looked at the ocean not as a boundary, but as a bridge. Across that water was France, and across France was America. And in America, she heard, fortunes could be made. Think of the courage it took. A young black woman, alone, with little money and no powerful name. To cross the sea in that era was no small thing. Ships were not luxurious escapes. They were cramped, harsh journeys, with seasickness and uncertainty as constant companions. But for Stephanie, seasickness was nothing compared to the sickness of staying behind. She boarded anyway, leaving the island that had given her hardship, and in that moment, she carried only one possession that mattered, her determination. The crossing to France must have felt endless, days blending into nights, the smell of salt and sweat filling the air, the vast ocean stretching forever in every direction. Many passengers crossed in fear of storms, fear of hunger, fear of the unknown waiting at the dock. Stephanie crossed with fire in her chest. She wasn't running away. She was running toward. France was not the end of her journey, but a proving ground. Here, she sharpened her French, read newspapers, absorbed politics, and soaked in the manners of the wealthy. She saw firsthand how power dressed, how it spoke, how it moved. And while she would never truly belong to France's elite, she learned how to imitate their confidence, how to carry herself with an aura of authority. It was a mask she could wear later, in Harlem, when appearance alone could make men hesitate. But even France had limits. The true promise, the real gold rush, was across the Atlantic. America, the land of skyscrapers, opportunity, and contradictions. A place where black people fled the South's chains only to find new shackles of segregation in the North. A place where the streets were said to be paved with gold, but only if you survived long enough to claim it. For Stephanie, America was not just a dream. It was destiny. So once again, she boarded a ship. This time, the crossing was longer, harsher, more uncertain. Imagine her standing on the deck, the wind tangling her hair, the Atlantic roaring beneath her. Behind her, Martinique was already fading into memory. Ahead of her, New York waited, with its lights, its shadows, its promises, and its traps. For a woman born in poverty, every step forward was rebellion. Every mile she crossed was defiance. She was not supposed to leave Martinique. She was not supposed to crave power. She was not supposed to dream beyond the island's borders. But she did. And each choice carved her into someone stronger, sharper, harder to break. By the time she set foot in America, she was no longer just Stephanie, the girl from Martinique. She was Stephanie St. Clair, the woman who would one day stare down the Mafia and refuse to flinch. But back then, arriving in New York in the early 1900s, she was just another immigrant. The docks smelled of fish and sweat. Languages clashed in the air, and the city towered over newcomers like a giant daring them to survive. For many, the city was a devourer. It swallowed men whole. It chewed up women and spit them out nameless. But Stephanie did not shrink. She stood taller. She told herself, I have already survived hunger. I have already stared down shame. What can this city take from me that I have not already lost? The truth is, New York was dangerous, chaotic, and indifferent. But in chaos, Stephanie found opportunity. She understood something vital. Power loves a vacuum. And Harlem, bursting with life, culture, and struggle, was full of those vacuums. She had the education, the boldness, the discipline to step into them. The hunger of her childhood became her weapon. Think about it. Poverty is like fire. For some, it consumes everything, leaving only ashes. For others, it forges steel. Stephanie was forged in that fire. And when she walked the streets of Harlem, she carried Martinique with her, not as a burden, but as armor. But the armor wasn't invincible. Memories of her early life haunted her, sometimes as whispers in her sleep, sometimes as rage in her veins. She had known too well the cruelty of want. And so, when she began to build her empire in Harlem, it wasn't just about money. It was about never feeling small again, never going hungry again, never being dismissed or silenced. She would turn her childhood scars into weapons sharper than any knife. The Queen of Harlem began as a barefoot girl on an island most of America never thought about. That is the irony of history. A forgotten fishing village gave birth to the woman who would one day stare down the Mafia and live to tell the tale. And yet, destiny is never straight. It is jagged, twisted, full of shadows. Stephanie's determination brought her across oceans, but the streets of Harlem were waiting with their own trials. Poverty had trained her to endure, but Harlem would test whether she could rule. The ocean had been her first battlefield. New York would be her second. And in those crowded streets, beneath the glow of Harlem's Renaissance, she would soon discover both her empire and her enemies. Chapter 3: Journey to America. The sea was merciless. Waves pounded the ship like fists against a door, and every crash of water reminded her how small she was, how fragile the human body is when faced with the vastness of the Atlantic. Passengers clutched rails, their knuckles white, their prayers swallowed by the roar of the ocean. Somewhere on that heaving deck stood Stephanie, young and unshaken, staring into the black horizon. She was not afraid of the storm. She had survived worse storms inside her own life. It was the early 1900s, and the voyage from Europe to America was not a glamorous passage. Forget champagne glasses and sweeping decks. For immigrants, it was cramped bunks, foul air, seasickness that lingered like a curse. The smell of sweat and salt clung to every surface. Mothers soothed children with lullabies muffled by the groans of the ship's hull. Men coughed into their hands, hiding the fear that they might not survive the crossing. But Stephanie, hardened by Martinique and sharpened by her time in France, did not let fear write her story. She stood upright, her chin lifted, as if daring the ocean to test her. This was no vacation. It was exile by choice. To board that ship meant leaving behind safety, however fragile, for the uncertainty of a world whispered about in songs and letters. America, the land where fortunes were made, where streets glittered with opportunity, where Harlem pulsed with the promise of rebirth. But promises have teeth. They bite the naive. And Stephanie knew that America was not waiting with open arms. It was waiting with open jaws. Still, she crossed. She believed that destiny favored the bold, and if it did not, then she would bend destiny herself. When the ship finally reached New York Harbor, the sight was unlike anything she had ever imagined. The skyline cut sharp against the morning light, towers reaching higher than her island's mountains, smoke curling like banners into the sky. And there, rising from the water, was the Statue of Liberty. For most, she was a beacon. For Stephanie, she was a challenge. That copper giantess held up her torch, as if to say, "This land belongs to the brave." Stephanie looked up and whispered silently, "I am brave enough." The docks were chaos. Crowds surged like waves, languages colliding into one another: Italian, Yiddish, English, Spanish, French. The air smelled of fish, sweat, and industry. Porters shouted. Horses clattered against cobblestones. Immigration officers barked orders. Every newcomer was another body in the machine, another dreamer in the city's endless appetite. Some stepped onto the pier with awe, others with terror. Stephanie stepped onto it with resolve. The year was around 1911, maybe 1912. Harlem was calling, though she didn't know it yet. At first, New York was overwhelming, a living beast with steel bones and brick skin. The noise was constant, the crowds endless. But Harlem was different. Harlem was alive in a way that made sense to her. Streets buzzing with color, neighbors spilling out onto stoops, music bleeding from doorways. Harlem was not just a place. It was a rhythm. And when Stephanie heard it, she recognized it like a heartbeat. Still, Harlem was no paradise. For every trumpet that played in a club, there was a landlord demanding rent from a family already stretched thin. For every poet standing tall in a salon, there was a child going hungry in the apartment below. Opportunity lived here, but so did poverty. Racism coiled around the city's edges, squeezing Harlem's residents into a neighborhood that was both sanctuary and cage. And yet, Harlem thrived. It turned pain into poetry, hunger into hustle, dreams into survival. Stephanie found herself drawn into that pulse. She rented a room, studied the streets, and watched how people moved. She saw the small hustles, the market stalls, the shoeshine boys, the gamblers throwing dice in alleys. She saw that Harlem was not just surviving, it was inventing. And where there is invention, there is power. She worked when she could, learning the city, sharpening her instincts. But Stephanie was never built to live quietly in the margins. She carried Martinique's hunger in her bones, France's polish in her manner, and now, Harlem's rhythm in her blood. She began to see connections others missed. The shoeshine boy depended on the gambler. The gambler depended on the banker. The banker depended on the community's trust. And trust, well, trust could be turned into empire. She wasn't running numbers yet, not officially. That world would open to her soon. But even then, even as a newcomer, people noticed her. The way she carried herself, the way she spoke. She had the kind of presence that made people listen. She didn't need a shout. Authority radiated from her like heat. And beneath it all, she carried a secret ambition. She was not in Harlem to blend in. She was there to rise. Every step she took on those cracked sidewalks was a step away from the barefoot girl of Martinique. She would never be that child again. But New York was dangerous. For every chance it offered, it demanded a price. Gangs patrolled corners. Corruption seeped into every layer of power. Police took bribes openly, their pockets lined with the sweat of the poor. Immigrants disappeared into factories, their dreams dissolved into exhaustion. Many who came with fire in their hearts left with ashes in their hands. The city did not care who you were. It tested you, broke you, swallowed you whole. Stephanie saw all of it, and she told herself, "I will not be swallowed." She began to write letters back home, boasting of her life, her possibilities. She painted a picture of confidence, even when the truth was harsher, because for her, image was as important as survival. If she could convince others she was thriving, she could convince herself too. And from that confidence, she built momentum. In Harlem, image mattered. Respect mattered. If you looked weak, the streets devoured you. If you looked strong, the streets gave way. Stephanie had learned long ago that survival was theater, and she became an actress no one could forget. As the 19-teens rolled into the 1920s, Harlem swelled with even more life. The Great Migration brought waves of black families north, fleeing Jim Crow, searching for something better. The neighborhood grew louder, busier, more electric. Jazz took root, and Harlem blossomed into something extraordinary, the Harlem Renaissance. It was a cultural revolution, and Stephanie stood in the middle of it, watching the stage being set for her own performance. She was no longer just an immigrant. She was a woman shaping her destiny. Every day in Harlem hardened her ambition. Every corner showed her both the beauty and brutality of the city. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was where she would build her empire. But empires are not built in peace. They are carved out of conflict. And as the 1920s began, Harlem's underworld stirred. The numbers game, still small in her early years, was growing into something massive. It was the heartbeat of the neighborhood, the secret economy no bank could touch. And it would not be long before Stephanie found her way to it. She had crossed the ocean. She had survived the storm. She had planted her feet in Harlem. But the true storm was yet to come. The question now was simple. Would Harlem bend to her will, or would it break her? Chapter 4. Harlem and Transformation. The streets of Harlem were swelling. They were not just streets anymore. They were rivers, surging with new faces, new rhythms, and new hunger. By the time Stephanie had planted her feet in New York, the neighborhood was shifting beneath her. It was no longer just a place. It was becoming a world. Imagine walking through Harlem in the years after 1910. Every train from the South carried not just luggage, but hope. Families stepped onto the platforms with their lives packed into a single suitcase, clutching children by the hand. They had fled Jim Crow's poison, traded cotton fields for concrete, and in their eyes burned a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. They were not just escaping the South. They were charging toward the possibility of dignity. This movement had a name, the Great Migration. It wasn't a trickle. It was a flood. Thousands, then hundreds of thousands of black men and women poured into northern cities, and Harlem became their capital. With every arrival, the neighborhood swelled. Tenements overflowed, churches filled, schools strained. But along with the pressure came fire. The fire of ambition. The fire of reinvention. And Harlem did something extraordinary. It turned that fire into light. Out of crowded apartments and overworked parents came art, music, literature, politics. The Harlem Renaissance. It was not just about jazz spilling from clubs or poets reading in smoky parlors. It was about a community declaring to America, "We will not be silent." Harlem became a stage, and the world was forced to watch. On one corner, you could hear the thunder of Duke Ellington's orchestra shaking the walls of the Cotton Club. On another, you could find Langston Hughes scribbling verses that spoke the truth of his people. Zora Neale Hurston laughed loudly in crowded salons, while painters splashed Harlem's heartbeat on a canvas. The Renaissance was everywhere, in music, in words, in colors, in ideas. It was joy pulled out of struggle, art carved from survival. Stephanie walked among this brilliance, but she saw something more. Where others saw only culture, she saw power. She knew culture could inspire, but money moved faster. And while Harlem was blossoming, it was also bleeding. For every jazz note, there was a landlord knocking. For every poem, there was a hungry child. Behind the glow of the Renaissance was a shadow economy, pulsing in alleys and backrooms. The underground. Harlem's official institutions shut their doors to the black community. Banks refused loans. Employers paid little. Landlords charged more than tenants could afford. So Harlem built its own economy in the shadows. Barbershops doubled as gambling houses. Candy stores ran numbers out of the back. Street corners became trading posts for bets, deals, and dreams. It was a world unseen by polite society, but it was real, and it was thriving. The jewel of that underground was the numbers game. To outsiders, it was illegal gambling. To Harlem, It was hope in 3 digits. For a penny, you could place a bet on a number. If it hit, you might win $20, maybe more. Enough to cover rent. Enough to buy dignity for a week. Enough to imagine life beyond hunger. People lined up daily, clutching their slips with the same reverence others reserved for church hymns. But behind those slips was an empire. Writers recorded bets. Collectors swept the streets for coins. Bankers counted cash late into the night. The numbers game was as structured as any corporation, except it belonged to Harlem. It put money into the hands of the poor, funded community projects, and gave people a chance, even if the odds were stacked against them. Stephanie studied it with fascination. To her, the numbers racket was not just gambling. It was mathematics, logistics, community trust. It was a business model disguised as a game. And in it, she saw her opening. Harlem was changing, growing, transforming, and she intended not just to live in that change, but to rule it. Still, the Renaissance was not just smoke and jazz. It carried contradictions. The Cotton Club played Ellington's music, but barred black patrons at the door. White visitors flocked to Harlem to drink, dance, and gawk at its vibrancy, but they returned to neighborhoods that barred black families from buying homes. Harlem thrived, but it also strained under exploitation. Every time the community built something, outside forces circled like vultures, waiting to feed. Stephanie recognized this pattern. She had seen it in Martinique, in France, and now in America. Power never let communities rise without resistance. And Harlem's transformation was not happening in a vacuum. The Italian mob watched closely. Police officers sharpened their teeth on bribes. Corrupt politicians eyed Harlem's votes. The Renaissance dazzled, but beneath the stage lights, the underworld gathered. For Harlem residents, it was a paradox. In the same night, you could see Billie Holiday singing her heart out, then step outside and watch a numbers runner chased by cops. You could hear Marcus Garvey rallying crowds about black pride, then walk a block and find a bootlegger pouring gin into glasses. Harlem was art and crime, laughter and hunger, ambition and oppression, all woven into one restless body. Stephanie thrived in paradox. She had always lived in the gap between two worlds, too ambitious for the island, too bold for France. Now, in Harlem, she found a stage wide enough for her ambition. She walked past the clubs and the storefronts, the preachers and the gamblers, and she saw the truth. Harlem was in transformation, yes, but transformations are fragile. Whoever controlled the underground economy would shape the future of the neighborhood, and Stephanie intended to be that person. But the road was not smooth. Harlem's underground was already crowded. Numbers bosses guarded their territories like wolves. Police raided when they wanted quick cash, and whispers of the Mafia's interest grew louder every month. To rise in this world meant stepping into danger with open eyes. It meant building loyalty where betrayal was cheap. It meant carrying yourself like royalty in a world that wanted you bowed. Stephanie was ready. She embraced Harlem as both a sanctuary and a battlefield. She learned the streets like a second language, memorized faces, gauged loyalties. Every bet placed, every corner hustled, was a thread in the fabric she would later weave into her empire. She was not yet the queen of Harlem, but the crown was forming. Still, Harlem itself was changing faster than anyone could control. By the early 1920s, the Renaissance reached its height. Jazz was America's soundtrack. Harlem's poets published books that shook the nation. Painters unveiled works that captured both beauty and struggle. White audiences poured into Harlem to consume its culture, treating the neighborhood like an exotic playground. Money flowed into clubs and theaters, but not always into the hands of the people who created the art. Harlem sparkled, but its residents still lived in crowded tenements, still counted coins to buy bread. That tension between glamour and grit, art and hunger, was the backdrop of Stephanie's rise. She knew the art mattered, but money built power. And Harlem's transformation meant opportunity for those bold enough to seize it. Picture her now, walking down 7th Avenue at dusk. Neon lights flickering above clubs, laughter spilling out of doorways, a saxophone crying into the night. Around her, the streets buzzed with energy, but Stephanie's mind was already beyond the music. She was watching the collectors tally slips. She was listening to whispers of who paid who trusted who cheated who. While others lost themselves in the Renaissance's glow, she was mapping the shadows. And the shadows were fertile ground. Because the truth is, the Renaissance was fragile. Art can dazzle, but it does not protect. Poems cannot fight gangsters. Jazz cannot feed children. And Harlem, for all its brilliance, needed someone ruthless enough to stand guard. Someone willing to play the underground game with discipline, strategy, and iron will. Stephanie was preparing to be that guardian, though she would never be soft about it. She did not believe in charity without power. To her, empowerment came through control. The underground, the numbers, the economy, they were weapons. And she was sharpening them. But storms were circling. The Italian mob wanted Harlem's numbers racket. Corrupt cops wanted their share. Politicians wanted votes without responsibility. And Harlem, radiant and restless, stood in the middle of it all. Stephanie looked at this transformation and saw both danger and destiny. She had crossed the ocean to find opportunity. Harlem gave it to her, wrapped in both gold and blood. The queen was not yet crowned, but the stage was built. The actors were gathering. And soon, the first shots of Harlem's underground war would echo through its crowded streets. The only question now was simple. Would Harlem's transformation lift her into legend or swallow her whole? Chapter 5. First steps into the numbers game. The sound of coins hitting a wooden counter was sharper than gunfire. Quick, metallic, urgent. In Harlem's backrooms, it wasn't bullets that decided who lived well, it was numbers. And one evening, Stephanie found herself staring at a small stack of betting slips, realizing for the first time that this was not just gambling. It was currency. It was survival. It was power. The numbers game wasn't glamorous on the surface. To an outsider, it looked like a cheap street lottery. People bet pennies on 3-digit numbers, slips scribbled by hand, odds whispered from one neighbor to another. But if you listen closer, you'd hear something more. You'd hear the heartbeat of Harlem. The mother risking her last nickel to maybe win enough for rent. The shoeshine boy hoping today's number might put food on the table. The old man chasing a dream bigger than his paycheck. To most, it was chance. To Stephanie, it was infrastructure. She had heard about it long before she touched her first slip. Whispers ran through barbershops, over poker tables, and candy stores. Numbers were everywhere, like smoke drifting through the streets. And like smoke, they were impossible to contain. The police tried, but the game always came back. It wasn't just illegal, it was unstoppable, because it belonged to the people. Stephanie was no fool. She knew Harlem was full of hustles. Dice games, card sharks, bootleg gin. But this was different. The numbers racket wasn't some fleeting hustle. It was a system, organized and reliable. For a penny, you could bet on a dream, and dreams are the most addictive currency on earth. Her first steps into it were cautious. She observed. She studied. She watched the way collectors worked the corners, their pockets jingling with coins. She watched writers record bets with lightning speed, ink staining their fingertips. She watched the bankers, hidden in backrooms, counting stacks of nickels and dimes with the precision of Wall Street brokers. It was chaos, but it was also order. A hidden economy as structured as any bank, except it was run by Harlem for Harlem. And that fascinated her, because Stephanie understood money differently than most. She had grown up with none of it. She had crossed oceans chasing it. And now, in Harlem, she realized that numbers weren't just about winning or losing. They were about control. If you controlled the game, you didn't just control the money. You controlled the people's trust. Her first involvement wasn't as a boss. Not yet. Every empire starts with a single step, and Stephanie was willing to start small. She learned the mechanics. She learned how bets were taken, how payouts were calculated, how to balance risk. She treated it like science, like a chessboard where every move mattered. To understand a numbers game, imagine rolling dice. If you bet that a certain sequence will come up, the odds are against you. But when the entire neighborhood plays, the odds create patterns. The bankers balanced those patterns. They knew how much money was coming in, how much they'd have to pay out, and how much they could keep. It was gambling, yes, but it was also mathematics, probability, discipline. It was a business dressed up as luck. Stephanie excelled at it. Numbers came to her naturally, but more importantly, trust did. People trusted her. She wasn't the kind of banker who cut corners or cheated players. She built her reputation on fairness. When someone won, she paid. When someone lost, she encouraged them to try again tomorrow. It sounds simple, but in Harlem, reputation was everything. People would forgive you for being ruthless. They would not forgive you for being dishonest. And Stephanie understood another truth. The numbers game wasn't just about math. It was about psychology. People played because they wanted hope. They wanted to believe tomorrow could be different. Stephanie gave them that hope, not by promising miracles, but by making the game feel honest. She turned herself into a figure players could rely on, and in doing so, she laid the foundation for something far larger. But trust came at a price. The streets were crowded with rivals, men who saw the numbers racket as their territory, men who didn't like the idea of a woman stepping into their world. Harlem's underworld was not a democracy. It was survival of the boldest. And Stephanie was stepping onto a stage where boldness could get you killed. She played carefully at first. She avoided direct confrontations, building her network quietly, one block at a time. She recruited collectors who respected her discipline. She paid them fairly, demanded loyalty, and offered protection in return. Her operation was small, but it was efficient. And efficiency in Harlem's underworld was rare enough to be noticed. Still, danger shadowed her every move. The police raided numbers spots regularly, dragging men into the street, stuffing pockets with bribes before looking the other way. Corrupt officers wanted their cut, and bosses who refused to pay found themselves in cells or coffins. Stephanie, however, was different. She didn't cower before the police. She didn't shrink when they demanded money. She looked them in the eye and negotiated. It was risky, but it earned her a reputation. She wasn't just another banker. She was a fighter, and Harlem noticed. The people saw her not just as a woman running numbers, but as someone who cared. She invested back into the community, helping neighbors when they needed rent money, defending workers against crooked landlords. These weren't acts of charity. They were investments in loyalty, and loyalty is the one currency stronger than cash. By the mid-1920s, Stephanie's small operation had grown into something formidable. She wasn't the biggest banker in Harlem. Not yet, but she was on her way. Every day, more collectors carried her slips. Every night, more coins stacked in her backrooms. And every week, her reputation deepened. She was fair. She was disciplined. And most importantly, she was fearless. But fearless does not mean invincible. Her rise attracted enemies. Rival bankers resented her presence. Men whispered that she was too ambitious, too visible, too bold for her own good. And in Harlem, whispers had a way of turning into bullets. Stephanie knew this. She had always known it. But she did not back down. She dressed like royalty, carried herself like authority, and reminded everyone who doubted her that she was not there to blend in. She was there to rule. The numbers game had given her the first taste of real power. But power is addictive. It does not satisfy, it hungers. And as Stephanie climbed, so too did her ambition. She didn't just want to play the numbers. She wanted to control them, to take the entire game under her command. Yet Harlem was changing. The Italian mob was circling. Dutch Schultz had already begun expanding his empire from the Bronx, and his eyes were fixed on Harlem's profits. For now, Stephanie's battles were with local rivals, corrupt cops, and the daily grind of building an empire. But on the horizon, a larger war was brewing. And when it came, the lessons she learned in these first steps, the math, the psychology, the trust, the defiance, would decide whether she survived or became another forgotten casualty of Harlem's shadows. For now, though, the queen was still rising. Each coin counted, each slip recorded, each loyal runner brought her closer to the crown she had always imagined. But crowns are heavy, and Harlem's underworld had a way of breaking the ones who dared to wear them. The question now was not whether she could run numbers. It was whether she could keep them, once the wolves closed in. Chapter 6. Building her empire. The coins no longer clinked on someone else's counter. They clinked on hers. The slips no longer passed through another banker's fingers. They ended in her hands. By the mid-1920s, Stephanie was no longer testing the waters of the numbers game. She was shaping them, bending Harlem's hidden economy around her own will. For the first time in her life, she wasn't surviving inside someone else's system. She was building her own. Picture the scene. A cramped back room on a Harlem avenue, smoke coiling against the ceiling, runners lined up with pockets heavy from the day's work. They emptied coins, nickels and dimes spilling into tin buckets, slips stacked in neat piles, hands ink-stained and trembling from the long grind. At the center of it all sat Stephanie, straight-backed, elegant, her eyes sharp as razors. Every coin was counted. Every slip was double-checked. She demanded perfection, and those around her knew better than to test her patience. It was not just bookkeeping. It was ceremony. These nightly rituals were the heartbeat of her empire. Each coin represented trust. Each slip represented hope. And Stephanie treated both as sacred. Where other bankers skimmed from the pot, pocketing winnings or stalling payouts, she paid in full, on time, every time. That reliability turned her into something more than a banker. She became a pillar. In Harlem, where landlords cheated and employers exploited, Stephanie's word was iron. If she said you'd be paid, you were paid. That was how empires begin, not with violence, not with fear, but with trust. Still, trust alone wasn't enough. To run numbers on Harlem scale, you needed infrastructure. Stephanie created one. She organized collectors like an army, each assigned to specific blocks, each responsible for their players. She appointed writers, skilled with quick hands, who could log bets faster than the eye could follow. She placed lieutenants in charge of routes, enforcing discipline and loyalty. It was a system as clean as any corporation, but tougher, leaner, built to survive raids and betrayals. And at the top of it all was her, the queen. The brilliance of her operation lay in how ordinary it looked. To passers-by, the corner store was just a candy shop. The barber's chair was just a place for a haircut. The newsstand was just paper and ink. But behind the candy, beneath the haircuts, inside the folded newspapers, bets were moving. Nickels flowed from hand to hand like blood through veins. And Stephanie was the heart pumping it all. She understood something vital. Power isn't in being seen, it's in being felt. You didn't always have to see her to know she was there. Her influence stretched across Harlem like invisible strings, pulling, guiding, shaping. A player might never meet her face to face, but they felt her presence every time their winnings were paid honestly, every time a collector showed up on time, every time the system ran without fail. But behind the efficiency was something more personal. Stephanie built loyalty not just with money, but with dignity. She demanded respect for her workers. Collectors were paid fairly, and they were protected. Writers knew that if police harassed them, she would handle it. In a world where men treated workers as disposable, Stephanie gave hers a sense of belonging. And belonging is a weapon more powerful than fear. Her backrooms buzzed with discipline. She kept ledgers with precision, balancing bets and payouts like a Wall Street broker. She used code words, hidden signals, decoys to keep the police guessing. When raids did come, her people were trained, slips hidden, coins dispersed, evidence vanished before a badge could cross the threshold. She thought like a general, anticipating every weakness and fortifying it. Yet, even generals bleed if they misstep. Harlem was crawling with rivals. Other bankers eyed her rise with suspicion. Some tried to sabotage her, undercutting odds, spreading whispers, bribing her runners to flip. But Stephanie countered every move. When rivals cheated, she paid double to prove her integrity. When rivals threatened, she tightened her circle. When rivals mocked the idea of a woman running numbers, she made sure their players drifted toward her tables instead. Every insult became leverage. Every challenge became proof. And Harlem noticed. The people saw a woman who dressed like royalty, carried herself with authority, and kept her promises. They saw someone who, against every expectation, held her ground in a man's world and refused to bow. The streets gave her a name whispered with both awe and caution, Madame St. Clair. Her empire grew, and with it, her influence. She wasn't just moving coins, she was moving lives. Rent money, grocery money, tuition. Every payout strengthened the bond between her and the community. And as the years passed, she became more than a banker. She became a figure of pride. Harlem had poets and musicians, yes. But in Stephanie, they had a queen who ruled the shadows with elegance and fire. Still, the shadows were dangerous. Police corruption never slept. Officers shook down runners, demanded bribes, staged raids to remind bankers who really controlled the city. Many bankers folded under the pressure, paying whatever the badge demanded. Stephanie did not. She confronted corruption head-on, calling it out in Harlem's newspapers, naming names, shaming officers who thought themselves untouchable. It was a bold move, so bold it bordered on suicidal. But it earned her even more loyalty from the people. She wasn't just making money from Harlem. She was defending it. That defiance carried weight. It also carried risk. The more visible she became, the more enemies circled. Harlem's underworld was not a safe throne. Rivals whispered about silencing her. Police sharpened their knives. And beyond Harlem, far beyond her immediate reach, the Italian Mafia was beginning to notice the profits flowing through the neighborhood. For now, they watched. But their gaze was heavy. Stephanie, though, refused to shrink. She built her empire with precision, expanding block by block, collector by collector. Her operation was a machine, and she was its relentless engine. Every coin clinking into her buckets was another step away from Martinique's poverty, another reminder that she had crossed oceans not to fade into the margins, but to carve her name into history. But the higher she rose, the thinner the air became. Empires demand constant vigilance. One slip, one betrayal, one moment of weakness, and the whole structure could collapse. Stephanie knew this. She had seen others rise and fall. She had seen kings dethroned, bosses buried, names erased. And she knew Harlem was not done testing her. On a cold night in the late 1920s, as she counted slips in one of her back rooms, a runner burst in, breathless, his face pale with fear. The whispers had finally turned into warnings. Rivals were planning something. A strike. A move against her. The room went silent. Coins frozen mid-count. Stephanie sat still, her face unreadable, her fingers resting lightly on the ledger. She had built her empire on trust, on loyalty, on discipline. But now, as the air thickened with tension, one truth pressed in: empires are always under siege. And the Queen of Harlem would soon learn just how far her enemies were willing to go to break her crown. Chapter 7. Rules, Fairness, and Respect. The crowd outside the corner store was restless. A man shouted, waving a crumpled slip in his hand, demanding the payout he'd been promised. Other bettors watched closely, their eyes sharp, their patience thin. In the numbers game, one unpaid winner could spark chaos, turning trust into fury overnight. Across Harlem, plenty of bankers try to cheat players, thinking a nickel here, a dime there wouldn't matter. But for the poor, every cent mattered. One missed payout meant no food, no rent, no hope. The streets remembered betrayal, and betrayal killed faster than bullets. This was the world Stephanie stepped into, and this was where she set herself apart. She made rules, and she lived by them. When you played her numbers, you got paid. No excuses, no stalling, no cheating. If the slip hit, the coins were in your hand by nightfall. People talked about it on stoops, whispered it in barber chairs, spread it through candy stores. Madame St. Clair kept her word. And in Harlem, where so many promises have been broken by landlords, employers, and politicians, that meant everything. Trust became her weapon. Her reputation grew block by block, not through violence, but through consistency. She didn't skim from winnings. She didn't shortchange players. When her runners showed up, they were punctual, polite, disciplined. Where rival bankers used muscle, Stephanie used respect, and the people noticed. They weren't just gambling with her. They were investing trust in her. That trust was radical in Harlem's underworld. Many bankers treated players like sheep to be sheared. They pocketed winnings, blamed errors on collectors, shrugged when players demanded fairness. Their logic was simple. The poor had no power. What could they do? But Stephanie knew better. The poor had one power greater than any gangster's gun: word of mouth. Harlem's gossip was fast and merciless. One scandal could ruin an operation overnight. One bad story could empty a banker's pocket faster than a police raid. Stephanie guarded against it like a general guards against ambush. She insisted her collectors be clean, reliable, and respectful. She paid them well enough that betrayal wasn't tempting. And she watched everything. If someone slipped, they were gone. If someone cheated, they were punished. Not publicly, not brutally, but decisively. Discipline was the backbone of her empire. And discipline earned her respect. Respect, for Stephanie, wasn't a soft word. It was steel. It was the difference between order and chaos. Without respect, Harlem's underworld was just noise, betrayals, robberies, killings. With respect, it became a machine. She understood this instinctively, perhaps because she had grown up with none. As a girl in Martinique, no one respected her hunger, her ambition. In France, she had been invisible. In New York, as a black immigrant woman, she was expected to bow. She refused. Respect was not given to her. So she built a world where it could no longer be denied. The people rewarded her. Bettors returned to her week after week, confident that their pennies were safe. Collectors stayed loyal, proud to work under a boss who valued them. Even rivals, grudgingly, began to acknowledge her discipline. She was not just another banker clawing for scraps. She was a leader who ruled by principle, in a world where principle was rare. But principles are dangerous when they challenge the system. Stephanie's fairness was not just about business. It was a statement. In a city where landlords stole, bosses underpaid, and police extorted, she was a figure who refused to cheat her own people. Every payout was an act of defiance against the corruption crushing Harlem. And that defiance did not go unnoticed. Police officers began to resent her stubbornness. They expected bribes, obedience, submission. Stephanie gave none willingly. She paid when she had to, yes, but never bowed. She treated them like men with hands outstretched, not gods with power absolute. And every time she refused to grovel, their hatred deepened. Her rivals hated her too, but for different reasons. Her fairness exposed their corruption. Every time she paid honestly, their lies looked sharper. Every time she honored a bet, their cheats looked uglier. She made them look weak, and in the underworld, weakness was unforgivable. And yet, they couldn't stop her. Because Harlem's people loved her. They called her Madam. They tipped their hats when she passed, whispered blessings for her health, admired the jewels she wore not just as symbols of wealth, but as symbols of victory. To see her draped in furs, walking with regal stride, was to see possibility. If she could rise, maybe anyone could. She didn't hide her wealth, but she didn't flaunt it cruelly either. She gave back. She funded legal aid for neighbors wronged by police. She helped families with rent. She supported community projects. Every dollar invested back into Harlem wasn't charity. It was strategy. It bound the people to her, made her untouchable in ways money alone never could. But no one is untouchable forever. The more her reputation grew, the more she attracted envy. Whispers swirled that she was too powerful, too bold, too visible. Her refusal to cheat made her admirable to Harlem, but dangerous to rivals. They thrived on corruption. She thrived on fairness. In their eyes, she was not just competition. She was a threat to the way the underworld functioned. The tension simmered beneath the surface. In one corner of Harlem, a rival banker underpaid a player, only to hear that Madam had paid full. The player never returned. In another, a collector switched sides, lured by the promise of dignity under her rule. Rivals seethed, plotting, waiting for a chance to cut her down. Stephanie knew it. She could feel the eyes on her. But she did not flinch. She believed that respect was armor, that as long as the people stood with her, she could weather the storms. But even armor cracks under enough pressure. And storms were gathering. In the late 1920s, Harlem was more crowded than ever. More migrants arrived daily, swelling the neighborhood, feeding the underground economy. The numbers game grew richer, and with riches came predators. The Italian mob watched from the sidelines, their gaze colder, heavier. They didn't care about fairness, about respect. They cared about profit. And profit was flooding Harlem like a river after rain. Stephanie's rules had built her empire. Her fairness had crowned her queen. But those same principles painted a target on her back. Because in a world ruled by greed and corruption, fairness was dangerous. Fairness made you stand out. Fairness made you vulnerable. And as Harlem's skies darkened with the shadow of the Mafia, the question hung heavy. Would fairness be her strength or her downfall? Chapter 8. Luxury and Style. The doors swung open, and silence followed her in. Not because Harlem was unfamiliar with wealth. Harlem in the 1920s sparkled with feathers, sequins, and brass trumpets, but because no one else wore power the way she did. Stephanie did not just arrive in a room. She claimed it. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and for a moment the jazz itself seemed to pause. She draped herself in silk and velvet, her gown stitched from the finest Parisian designs, her fingers heavy with diamonds that caught the light like fire. Around her neck hung pearls so large they looked stolen from the sea itself. On her head, wide-brimmed hats framed her face like crowns, casting shadows that dared men to meet her gaze. Harlem had never seen a woman like her. Not on its stages, not in its politics, not in its underworld. And that was the point. Her empire was built in backrooms and alleys, but her image was built in public. She knew appearances were weapons. Where rivals skulked in shadows, Stephanie stepped into the spotlight. Her wealth was not just decoration, it was armor. Every diamond was proof she could not be ignored. Every fur coat was a declaration that she had transcended the barefoot girl of Martinique. She didn't just want respect in Harlem's underworld. She wanted reverence. It worked. In a city where black families struggled to pay rent, where coins slipped through desperate fingers, Madame St. Clair glided down Lenox Avenue in cars polished to mirrors, her chauffeur opening doors like a servant to royalty. People watched her pass, and their reactions were complicated. Admiration, envy, pride, resentment. But no one could look away. She cultivated her presence with precision. She moved through Harlem's clubs like a queen inspecting her court. At the Cotton Club, where black patrons weren't even allowed in, she sat anyway, draped in jewels, sipping champagne as though the rules bent for her alone. At the Lafayette Theater, she took the best seats, dressed in gowns that outshone the performers. When she spoke, people listened, not just to her words, but to the authority in her tone, the certainty that she was above them, yet somehow carrying them with her. Luxury was not just indulgence for her. It was performance. She understood that Harlem, caught between glory and poverty, needed symbols. And she was determined to be one. Her wealth became spectacle, her style a kind of theater. To see her was to believe, if only for a moment, that Harlem's people could rise above the weight pressing down on them. But luxury is never only beauty. It is also power. In a world ruled by men, a woman could be dismissed in an instant, unless she forced men to see her as something untouchable. Stephanie weaponized glamour. Where a pistol might command fear, a diamond necklace commanded awe. Where fists could silence a room, her presence silenced it longer. She understood what so many gangsters missed. Fear fades. All lingers. Still, all carried its own dangers. Every jewel she wore, every fur she draped over her shoulders, made her a target. Rivals sneered, muttering that her arrogance would be her downfall. Police officers, already furious at her defiance, seethed at the sight of her wealth. To them, she wasn't just a criminal. She was insolence embodied, a black woman flaunting power in a city determined to keep her people down. Every diamond was an insult, every fur a taunt, every public appearance a challenge. Stephanie didn't care. She refused to live small. She had spent too many years being told she was less, invisible, disposable. Her luxury was revenge, carved into silk and stitched into velvet. It was a way of saying, I will not be erased. Behind closed doors, though, she was not always untouchable. The weight of her crown was heavy. She confided in close allies that wealth was both shield and chain. She could never appear weak, never admit fear, never stumble. Every outing required performance. Every gown carried expectation. She had turned her life into theater, and the stage never dimmed. But she accepted the burden because the alternative was worse. To live small, to blend into the crowd, to bow to Harlem's predators. That was a death worse than any bullet. Better to be envied, hated, and feared than to be forgotten. She spent freely, not just on herself but on her empire. Her workers wore clean clothes. Her collectors carried themselves with dignity. She made sure her operation didn't look like a street hustle. It looked like business. That mattered. Harlem respected professionalism, and Stephanie's new image had to match discipline. A banker who looked sloppy inspired no loyalty. A banker who looked like royalty inspired devotion. And she understood something deeper still. In Harlem, style was survival. The Renaissance had proved that art could be weaponized against despair. Musicians dressed sharp not just to perform, but to command dignity. Poets wore tailored suits because words carried more weight when spoken from a body wrapped in confidence. Stephanie mirrored that. Her luxury wasn't isolated from Harlem's culture. It was Harlem's culture, magnified. Yet her commanding presence did not just dazzle. It provoked. Every time she walked into a club draped in wealth, rivals clenched their teeth. Every time she stepped out of her car in diamonds, corrupt cops sharpened their knives. She was too visible, too bold, too fearless. Harlem adored her, but the world outside Harlem wanted to break her. And that danger crept closer with every passing year. By the late 1920s, Dutch Schultz had begun carving his empire through New York, his violence spilling over borough by borough. When his eyes turned toward Harlem, Stephanie's diamonds would no longer be symbols of defiance. They would be targets. To him, her wealth was not awe. It was a prize to be stolen. For now, though, she reigned. She wore her jewels like a shield, her gowns like banners, her presence like a crown. She had turned herself into a living symbol of Harlem's possibility, a queen striding through a kingdom, still finding its voice. But symbols cannot stop bullets. And the day was coming when her diamonds would not just draw admiration, they would draw fire. Chapter 9. The Harlem Power Broker. The room fell quiet when she spoke. Not because she shouted, she rarely raised her voice, but because her words carried weight. Leaders, artists, hustlers, and dreamers all leaned closer when Stephanie St. Clair gave her opinion. In Harlem, power wasn't always measured in bullets or bribes. Sometimes it was measured in influence. And Stephanie had more of it than anyone expected a woman from Martinique to ever hold. Her empire of numbers had bought her more than wealth. It bought her a seat at Harlem's table of power. And that table was crowded with men who claimed to speak for the neighborhood. Ministers thundered from pulpits, politicians campaigned in smoky halls, activists rallied crowds on the corners. But Stephanie was different. She didn't preach. She didn't beg for votes. She didn't wait for permission. She acted, and that made her indispensable. Harlem's Renaissance had already proven that words could move nations. Poets like Langston Hughes and writers like Claude McKay were giving Harlem a voice America could no longer ignore. Musicians filled the clubs with rhythms that reshaped the country's heartbeat. And somewhere among these artists walked Stephanie, draped in silk and diamonds, speaking with the same authority as any preacher or poet. She wasn't writing verses or blowing horns, but her power was cultural all the same. She symbolized Harlem's defiance. When artists needed funding for projects, she quietly offered it. When organizers needed protection from police raids, she arranged it. When politicians ignored Harlem's cries, she used her influence to remind them that votes could be swayed, that crowds could be moved. Harlem's power was collective, and Stephanie, with her empire and her wealth, became one of its keystones. People looked at her and saw more than a banker. They saw a woman who had forced her way into a world that didn't want her, a woman who had broken rules and written her own. She became living proof that Harlem could rise. To the poets, she was a muse. To the hustlers, she was a model. To the ordinary men and women who bet pennies on her numbers, she was a symbol of pride. But pride was dangerous. Her connection to Harlem's leaders gave her protection, yes, but it also painted her as a rival to forces far bigger than Harlem itself. Politicians who thought they controlled the neighborhood found themselves outshined by her influence. Preachers who thought they commanded loyalty watched their congregants whisper about Madame St. Clair with reverence. Artists who thought they set the tone of the Renaissance admitted, privately, that her presence in a room shifted the energy as much as a verse or a trumpet solo. Stephanie didn't seek to be loved in the same way the artist did. She sought to be respected. Love was fleeting. Respect endured. She cultivated it carefully, meeting with leaders, shaking hands with activists, attending salons where Harlem's intellectuals debated into the night. She was as comfortable quoting French poets as she was calling out police corruption in the papers. She moved seamlessly between Harlem's shadow economy and its cultural elite, a bridge between worlds most men never dared to cross. Still, she remained untouchable in her own way. To the artists, she was fascinating but distant, a queen among mortals. To the hustlers, she was both inspiration and warning. Rise too fast, and you risk painting a target on your back. To the community, she was legend, her life proof that Harlem's struggles could produce royalty. And yet, even as she gained influence, she never forgot the streets that had built her. She walked among the people, tipping her hat to shopkeepers, greeting neighbors with warmth. She didn't wall herself off in mansions or vanish behind gates. Her presence on the streets was calculated but real. She understood that power doesn't survive without visibility. Harlem needed to see her, to believe in her. She gave them that one glance, one word, one appearance at time. Her role as power broker grew in subtle ways. When disputes broke out between rivals in the numbers racket, she often mediated, not through courts, but through her reputation. Her word could calm tempers. Her presence could settle scores. When police overstepped, beating or robbing Harlem residents, she used her newspaper ads to shame them, wielding public opinion like a blade. When landlords pushed too far, she funded resistance. She wasn't always gentle. She wasn't always right. But she was always decisive. And decisiveness is a currency more valuable than gold in a neighborhood under siege. But influence brings attention, and attention brings enemies. Police resented her because she was unafraid to expose them. Politicians resented her because she commanded loyalty they couldn't buy. Rivals resented her because her fairness made their corruption harder to hide. And beyond Harlem, the Italian mob began to hear her name with increasing frequency. A woman, a black immigrant, running an empire with loyalty and dignity. To them, it was intolerable. Harlem's profits belonged to them, or so they believed. Stephanie knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to test her. But for now, she leaned in her role, reveling in the strange balance she held. She was both criminal and benefactor, outlaw and icon. In a city that thrived on contradiction, she embodied it better than anyone. One evening, at a salon filled with artists and activists, someone remarked that Harlem had its kings and its queens, its poets and its prophets, but only one person truly bridged them all. All eyes turned toward Stephanie. She smiled, raised her glass, and let the silence say what she didn't need to. The silence was broken by applause. But applause can fade. For all her influence, Stephanie understood something few others did. Power is fragile. It lives in perception, and perception can shift overnight. A scandal, a betrayal, a sudden act of violence. Any of it could topple her carefully constructed image. She walked a tightrope, balancing wealth, respect, and fear, knowing one misstep could send her crashing down. And Harlem, radiant and restless, was a stage full of rivals eager to watch her fall. The Queen of Harlem was now more than a banker. She was a broker of influence, a connector of worlds. But beyond the salons and clubs, beyond the admiration of poets and the envy of rivals, shadows were thickening. Because when power becomes undeniable, it does more than inspire. It provokes. And the men who ruled New York's underworld were almost ready to make their move. Chapter 10: War Against Corruption. The newspaper hit the stands like a thunderclap. Harlem residents picked it up, unfolded the broad pages, and froze at the sight. A full advertisement, bold letters, paid for by none other than Madame St. Clair. And in it, she named names. She accused police officers of theft, of brutality, of corruption so brazen it reeked. The streets buzzed with disbelief. A black woman, an immigrant, a numbers banker, challenging the New York Police Department in public print? It was unheard of. It was reckless. It was brilliant. This was not a quiet war. Stephanie declared it openly, with ink instead of bullets, with words instead of whispers. She had seen too much to stay silent. Her runners were shaken down weekly, their pockets emptied by crooked cops who claimed protection money as their own. Bettors were harassed, winnings stolen under the guise of raids. Even when she paid her share to keep her operation safe, greedy officers came back, always demanding more. And Stephanie had had enough. She chose a weapon few in her position would dare touch: publicity. For her, the numbers game had always been more than money. It was community trust, a fragile pact between Harlem's poor and those who ran the underground. When police broke that pact, terrorizing her people, they weren't just stealing coins. They were stealing hope. Stephanie could tolerate rivals. She could fight Mafia incursions, but she would not let Harlem bow to men who wore badges as masks for their crimes. So she went to the papers. The Amsterdam News, the New York Age, black-owned presses that gave voice to Harlem when mainstream outlets refused. She bought entire pages, scrawled with bold words accusing officers of extortion. She printed details, incidents, truths most feared to whisper. It was as if she turned on a spotlight, forcing corruption into daylight. Harlem erupted. Some cheered her audacity, hailing her as more than a banker, seeing her as a defender. Others feared for her life. To accuse the police publicly was to invite wrath. But Stephanie thrived on wrath. She had spent her entire life daring the world to test her. And now she dared the law itself. Imagine the fury of the police department. Men in blue, used to unquestioned authority, opening their morning papers to see their own names dragged through the mud. They fumed in precincts, cursed in bars, whispered plans to silence her. To them, she was not just a nuisance. She was an enemy who had humiliated them in front of the very people they ruled through fear. But Stephanie didn't flinch. She walked Harlem's streets draped in diamonds, as visible as ever, daring them to touch her. And Harlem loved her for it. In a time when most feared the police more than thieves, she stood defiant. She gave the community a symbol of resistance, proof that corruption could be called out, even if justice was slow to follow. This war was not fought with pistols in alleys. It was fought with reputation. Stephanie's words carried more power than bullets, because they shifted perception. She exposed the police not as protectors, but as predators. And once the community saw that truth in print, it could not be unseen. But every action had consequences. Raids against her operations grew harsher. Collectors were beaten, runners dragged into cells. Officers harassed her openly, spitting insults as they shook down businesses tied to her name. She had poked the bear, and the bear was clawing back. Still, she adapted. She trained her people to handle raids, to hide slips quickly, to stash money in decoys. She used codes and signals to keep business alive under pressure. And all the while, she kept printing ads, week after week, hammering her message into Harlem's consciousness. She was not just running numbers anymore. She was running a campaign. Her defiance elevated her beyond the underworld. Activists and intellectuals, men who once dismissed her as a gambler, began to see her as an ally in Harlem's larger struggle. Her wealth funded causes. Her boldness inspired writers. Her refusal to bow mirrored the community's own hunger for dignity. She had crossed a line, from outlaw to power broker, from banker to figurehead. But that visibility was a double-edged sword. Every headline drew more attention, not just from police, but from politicians, from journalists, from rival gangs, and from the Mafia itself. Her name spread beyond Harlem, whispered in the Bronx, in Manhattan, in the smoke-filled rooms where men planned empires. They began to ask, who was this woman who dared challenge the law so openly? Who gave her the right to wield such influence? And how long before someone decided she needed to be silenced? Stephanie knew the risk. She understood that ink could provoke as much violence as lead. But she also knew that silence was worse. If she bowed now, Harlem would lose more than a banker. It would lose its queen. One evening, after another ad hit the papers, she returned home to find a warning scrawled on her door. A single word. Enough. It was the police, or rivals, or perhaps even both. She studied the word for a long moment, then turned away without erasing it. Warnings only mattered if you believed in fear. Stephanie believed in defiance. But deep down, she must have known that her war with corruption could not go on forever. Enemies were multiplying, and Harlem's underworld was shifting. The Italian mob was growing bolder, preparing to move north into Harlem's territory. Dutch Schultz, unpredictable and violent, was already circling, eager to carve up the numbers racket for himself. The police were dangerous, yes, but the real storm was still on the horizon. And when it arrived, Stephanie's defiance would be tested in ways even her boldest words could not shield her from. Chapter 11. Enter Dutch Schultz. Blood dripped onto a Bronx sidewalk, still warm, still fresh, still shocking to anyone who thought Dutch Schultz could be crossed. The man responsible didn't blink. He never did. Schultz built his empire on the philosophy that fear was cheaper than negotiation and more permanent than loyalty. In his world, business wasn't business. It was survival, and survival was bought with blood. Harlem, with its bustling numbers racket, didn't know it yet, but its greatest storm was coming from the Bronx. Dutch Schultz was born Arthur Flegenheimer, a German-Jewish kid from the Bronx who carried the weight of poverty like a stone in his pocket. He grew up watching opportunity slip past his family, his father abandoning them when he was still young. Resentment hardened him early. Where some kids turned to school, Dutch turned to the streets. He learned that a sharp tongue and a quicker trigger could make a man more money than a diploma ever would. Prohibition gave him his opening. When alcohol went underground, Dutch dug deep. He smuggled beer and liquor through speakeasies, bribed cops, greased politicians, and carved out the Bronx as his personal kingdom. By his mid-20s, he was already a millionaire, his name whispered in backrooms and printed in headlines. He wore fine suits, but his manners never softened. Dutch was vulgar, unpredictable, prone to outbursts that terrified even his own man. But violence made him unstoppable. Rivals disappeared. Dissenters were silenced. And the Bronx learned quickly, Dutch Schultz was not a man you cross twice. But ambition doesn't stop at borough borders. Dutch's empire was hungry, and Harlem looked like a feast. He saw it clearly. The numbers racket was a gold mine, an underground lottery feeding off Harlem's hope and desperation. To Schultz, it didn't matter that the game was a lifeline for Harlem's poor. It didn't matter that the community saw it as their own creation. All he saw was profit, and profit belonged to him. At first, Harlem was cautious. Rumors drifted uptown about Schultz's brutality. People whispered about bodies found in alleys, about his men shaking down bar owners until their pockets turned inside out. Harlem's bankers had built their world on discipline and trust, but Schultz had no interest in trust. He believed in terror. He believed that if you broke enough bones, loyalty followed. His first moves into Harlem were quiet but forceful. Collectors found themselves beaten. Storefronts tied to numbers operations were suddenly raided. Runners were offered money to switch sides, and when they refused, they vanished. It was a strategy as old as war. Intimidate, infiltrate, conquer. For Harlem, Schultz's methods were shocking. The numbers racket had always been competitive, yes, but it had also been rooted in community. Bettors trusted bankers because they lived among them. Disputes were settled with words more often than weapons. Schultz shattered that balance. He brought with him the logic of the Mafia. Fear first, profit second, dignity never. And Harlem was not ready. At least, not yet. Stephanie St. Clair was watching all of this unfold. She had heard the rumors, seen the bruises on her runners, listened to the fear in their voices when Schultz's name came up. She understood the threat better than most. This was not just another rival banker. This was a predator from outside, a man who didn't care about Harlem, who saw it only as territory. And predators didn't stop until they were either fed or killed. But before Stephanie could act, she studied him. She read his moves like a chess player studies an opponent's strategy. Dutch Schultz was not subtle. He attacked fast, broke resistance, and flooded the gap with his own men. He used bribery where it worked, bullets where it didn't. He was reckless, but his recklessness was backed by money, power, and connections that stretched deep into New York's political machine. Harlem's smaller bankers began folding under the pressure. Some paid him tribute to avoid bloodshed. Others disappeared. Schultz's men spread like a shadow up Lenox Avenue, watching, waiting, squeezing. Harlem could feel the air changing, the sense that their independence was slipping, that the Bronx's grip was tightening. But not everyone bowed. Stephanie refused. Her defiance was a spark in the darkness, but it was a dangerous spark. Schultz had never tolerated defiance before, and he wasn't about to start now. He mocked her openly, dismissing the idea that a woman, let alone a black immigrant woman, could stand in his way. But beneath his arrogance was caution. Even Schultz couldn't ignore that Stephanie had built something real, something disciplined, something beloved by Harlem's people. Killing her might not be so simple. It might make her a martyr, and martyrs are dangerous. Still, Schultz wasn't the kind of man to hesitate for long. His expansion was inevitable. His violence was predictable, and his shadow was growing larger every day. Harlem's independence was under siege, its future uncertain, its queen preparing for war. One night, as jazz spilled from the clubs and the streets buzzed with weekend life, a shot rang out on a quiet corner where one of Stephanie's collectors had been working. He fell to the pavement, blood pooling beneath him, a message written in silence. Schultz was coming, and he was not asking permission. The Harlem Queen now stood at the edge of her greatest test. The Bronx Butcher had entered the stage, and he didn't care about rules, fairness, or respect. The question that lingered in the night air was brutal in its simplicity. Could Stephanie's crown withstand Dutch Schultz's war? Chapter 12. The Mafia's Harlem Ambitions. The envelope slid across the table. Inside was cash thick, damp from nervous palms, the kind of tribute that spoke louder than words. The man who offered it was trembling, his eyes lowered, his pride broken. Across from him, one of Dutch Schultz's lieutenants smirked, pocketing the money without thanks. Another banker had surrendered. Another piece of Harlem had been claimed. The message spread faster than any bullet. Pay up or disappear. This was the Mafia's Harlem strategy. It was simple, brutal, and efficient. Fear first, bribe second, blood last. Schultz and the Italian mob weren't interested in Harlem's history, its culture, or the fact that the numbers game had been built by the community for the community. To them, Harlem was just a market, a territory, a prize to be taken. The numbers racket was too lucrative to ignore. Every day, pennies poured in from thousands of players, small bets multiplying into fortunes. Harlem's people treated the game as their own lottery, their one shot at turning luck into life. But to Schultz, those pennies weren't dreams. They were dollars waiting to be stolen, and he intended to steal every last one. He didn't come alone. The Italian mob backed him, their influence stretching across New York like a net. Men like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello had already reshaped the city's underworld, turning it into a corporate empire of crime. They didn't waste time with petty hustles. They wanted monopolies. And Harlem's numbers racket was ripe for consolidation. Schultz was their chosen hammer, the blunt force they unleashed uptown. At first, the takeover seemed inevitable. Schultz's men stormed Harlem with fists and guns, beating collectors, raiding bankers' offices, threatening shopkeepers who hosted number riders in their backrooms. Some surrendered quickly. They figured it was better to pay a cut to Schultz than to end up on the pavement. Others resisted, but resistance often ended in silence. Bodies dumped in alleys, warnings scrawled in blood. Fear spread through Harlem like a virus. Storefront owners closed early, afraid of Schultz's thugs storming through their doors. Collectors kept slips hidden deep in their clothes, terrified of being caught. Conversations grew hushed when his name was mentioned. For many, it felt like Harlem's independence was slipping away. But not everyone was afraid. Stephanie St. Clair saw what Schultz and the Italians were doing, and she understood the stakes. This wasn't just about money. It was about sovereignty. The numbers game was more than a racket. It was Harlem's economy, Harlem's culture, Harlem's claim to independence in a city that denied them so much else. If Schultz succeeded, Harlem wouldn't just lose its bankers. It would lose its pride. Stephanie refused to hand over her empire. She rejected Schultz's offers, laughed at his threats, and doubled down on her own operation. Where others paid tribute, she fought back. And her defiance set the stage for a war that Harlem had never seen before. Schultz escalated. His men roamed the streets like wolves, cornering collectors, demanding loyalty under threat of death. They slipped bribes to corrupt cops, who turned raids into weapons against Harlem's independent bankers. One by one, the old guard folded, their systems absorbed into Schultz's growing machine. But Stephanie stood firm. She armed her runners with discipline, teaching them how to survive raids, how to move silently, how to hide slips faster than a cop could blink. She fortified her backrooms, tightened her circles, and made her operation sharper, leaner, harder to break. Most of all, she leaned into the one advantage Schultz could never buy: the loyalty of Harlem's people. Because the community saw the difference. Schultz was an invader. He didn't care if players were paid. He didn't care if Harlem bled. He cared only about profit. Stephanie cared. She paid out honestly. She protected her people. She invested in her neighborhood. And Harlem noticed. When given a choice between the queen and the butcher, many stayed loyal to her, even if it meant danger. That loyalty infuriated Schultz. He was used to compliance, to men folding before his threats. But Harlem was different. Harlem had roots, pride, defiance. And Stephanie embodied all of it. She mocked him in public, calling him out in the press, daring him to come for her. Her words were sharper than knives, and her boldness humiliated him. For Schultz, humiliation was unacceptable. He doubled down, pouring more men into Harlem, more bribes into police pockets, more violence onto the streets. Harlem's nights grew darker. Shootings echoed off the brick walls, blood staining the same sidewalks where children played by day. The war for Harlem's numbers had begun in earnest, and behind Schultz, the Italian mob watched carefully. They didn't care about his pride. They cared about results. If Schultz could deliver Harlem, he was valuable. If he failed, he was disposable. To them, Harlem was just another piece on the board, another profit stream to control. They had no interest in its independence, its culture, its queen. They wanted numbers, and they wanted them all. But Harlem was not an easy prize. Stephanie rallied her community, her influence stretching beyond her banking operation into Harlem salons, clubs, and newspapers. She reminded Harlem that their numbers were theirs, not the Mafia's. She turned herself into a symbol of resistance, a woman who stood alone against a machine of corruption and refused to kneel. Still, even symbols can bleed. Her collectors were attacked, her allies harassed, her name cursed in precinct houses and mob meetings alike. Every step forward brought risk. Every refusal to bow painted a larger target on her back. The war was no longer just business. It was personal. Schultz wanted her broken, humiliated, erased. One evening, as Harlem's clubs pulsed with jazz and laughter, word spread of another shooting. A banker loyal to Stephanie was gunned down outside his storefront, his blood soaking into the very ground Harlem fought to defend. The message was clear: surrender or be buried. But Stephanie did not surrender. She doubled her ads, sharpened her defenses, and walked Harlem's streets as boldly as ever, diamonds flashing under the street lamps. To many, it seemed reckless. To her, it was necessary. Fear was Schultz's weapon. Defiance was hers. The Mafia's Harlem ambitions were growing, their grip tightening, their violence escalating. Harlem braced itself, torn between loyalty and survival. And in the middle of it all stood one woman, daring the Bronx butcher and the Italian mob to take her crown. The storm had arrived. The only question now was who would survive it. Chapter 13. Intimidation Campaign. The body was left in the gutter as a message. His pockets turned inside out, his bedding slips scattered like confetti, his blood soaking into the Harlem pavement. People passing by stopped, stared, and whispered in fear. They didn't need to ask who had done it. Everyone already knew. Dutch Schultz's shadow was creeping further uptown, and the intimidation campaign had begun. This was how Schultz operated. Violence was not just punishment. It was theater. Every corpse was a warning. Every broken jaw was a press release. Where Stephanie had built her empire on trust and respect, Schultz carved his with fear and bribes. Harlem was about to learn the difference between loyalty and terror. The campaign unfolded in waves. First came the bribes. Schultz's men walked into candy stores and barbershops where numbers were written, sliding envelopes across counters. Easy money, they called it. Protection. Cooperation. Pay a cut to Schultz, and your business will be left alone. Some shopkeepers, terrified of blood on their doorsteps, accepted. They told themselves it was just business, just survival. But others resisted. And resistance came at a price. That price was violence. Collectors were dragged into alleys, beaten until their bones cracked, then dumped back onto the streets as examples. Bankers who refused Schultz's offers found their storefronts smashed, their windows shattered, their families threatened. Harlem's nights grew louder with the sounds of gunshots and screams. The numbers game, once rooted in community trust, was becoming a battlefield. People were terrified. Mothers begged their sons not to work as runners. Bettors hesitated before placing their pennies, afraid that their coins might fund a war they didn't want to be part of. Harlem buzzed with fear, and that was exactly what Schultz wanted. Fear spreads faster than money. Fear breaks people before bullets ever need to. But Schultz didn't rely on violence alone. He bought protection where fists couldn't reach. Police officers, already known for their corruption, began working openly for him. Raids were suddenly timed with precision, hitting Harlem bankers just as collections peaked, their money swept away and redirected into Schultz's coffers. Officers who once tolerated Harlem's independent bankers now cracked down, their loyalties purchased by Schultz's bribes. It was a two-front war. Harlem was squeezed by gangsters on one side and police on the other, and in between stood the bankers, caught in a vice that seemed impossible to escape. Many broke. They paid Schultz's tribute, surrendering their independence to survive. Harlem's once proud network of bankers shrank, their crowns snatched away, their empires dismantled piece by piece. But not Stephanie. She watched as her rivals fell, one after another, their names erased from Harlem streets. She saw the fear in her runners, the worry in her community. And she refused to bow. If Schultz wanted Harlem, he would have to take it from her by force. That defiance made her a target. Her collectors were harassed more than anyone else. Her businesses were raided more often. Her name cursed more loudly in police precincts and mafia meetings alike. Schultz's men tried to buy her silence, offering money, offering safety. She laughed in their faces, and with every refusal, the tension rose. Harlem held its breath. On one block, a banker loyal to Schultz's takeover was shot dead in his own storefront, his blood staining the slips he had once sold. On another, a young runner was found beaten beyond recognition, left barely alive as a warning. Each act of violence tightened the noose around Harlem's neck. Yet Stephanie's defiance carried weight. People admired her courage, even as they feared the cost. She became a symbol of resistance, proof that Harlem would not be conquered without a fight. Her presence reminded them that independence mattered, that Harlem's culture could not be bought or beaten into submission. Still, admiration doesn't stop bullets. The intimidation campaign grew relentless. By 1930, Schultz's grip on Harlem was tightening. Whole blocks had switched allegiance. Entire banking routes now answered to him. Money flowed steadily into his empire, feeding his ambition, strengthening his influence. The Italian mob watched, calculating, deciding how far to let him go. But Schultz made one mistake. He underestimated Harlem's pride. Because the more he tried to terrorize the neighborhood into submission, the more Harlem rallied around its queen. Stephanie's ads in the newspapers became sharper, her words more biting. She accused Schultz not just of greed, but of cowardice, of being too weak to fight fair. She called him an invader, a leech, a butcher, and Harlem listened. Harlem remembered. Still, word could only go so far, and Schultz's fists were growing heavier. The Intimidation campaign was reshaping Harlem's underworld. What had once been a numbers game rooted in trust was now a war zone ruled by fear. The old ways of doing business, fair payouts, quiet discipline, were being drowned in blood. The community's hope was slipping, its independence cracking, its dignity threatened. And through it all, Stephanie held her ground. Her defiance kept Harlem's spirit alive, but it also painted a larger target on her back. Every day, she refused to bend. Schultz grew more determined to break her. One night, as Harlem's clubs buzzed with music and the sidewalks glowed under street lamps, a rumor swept through the neighborhood. Schultz was planning something bigger, something final. Not just bribes, not just beatings, but an all-out assault to crush Harlem's resistance once and for all. The whispers chilled the air. Collectors looked over their shoulders. Bettors clutched their slips with trembling hands. And Stephanie, though outwardly calm, must have felt the weight pressing down. The Intimidation campaign had already scarred Harlem. But the storm gathering now promised something worse. The question hanging over Harlem was no longer whether Schultz would strike again. It was when, and how many bodies would be left in his wake. Chapter 14. The Harlem Numbers War. Gunfire cracked through Harlem like thunder splitting the night sky. A car screeched down 7th Avenue, windows lowered, pistols flashing in bursts of flame. People scattered, diving for cover, clutching children, screaming in terror. When the smoke cleared, the street was littered with shattered glass, bullet casings, and the silence of yet another warning. This was no longer intimidation. This was war. The Harlem Numbers racket, once a hidden lottery built on trust and community, had become a battlefield. Dutch Schultz's invasion had crossed the line, and Stephanie St. Clair was not backing down. Her defiance, her refusal to surrender her empire, had turned Harlem into ground zero for a conflict that would pit loyalty against fear, discipline against violence, community pride against Mafia greed. The war wasn't organized in neat battles. It erupted in fragments, sudden shootouts on crowded streets, bombings of storefronts, assassinations carried out in broad daylight. Collectors walking home with slips tucked under their coats found themselves ambushed. Bankers were pulled into cars, beaten, and dumped on the edges of the Bronx. Schultz's men spread terror like a poison, determined to break Harlem's will. But Harlem resisted. Stephanie rallied her people with the same fire she had always carried. Her runners were trained to move quietly, to hide slips in ways police and gangsters couldn't find. She tightened her network, making it harder for Schultz's men to infiltrate. And more importantly, she gave Harlem a reason to stand firm. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the neighborhood's independence. Her defiance inspired others. Collectors who could have folded stayed loyal, even when it meant risking their lives. Shopkeepers still hosted riders in their backrooms, despite threats. Bettors kept playing her numbers, whispering that if Harlem surrendered now, it would never belong to them again. In a city that often treated them like second-class citizens, Harlem clung to Stephanie's fight as proof they had the right to stand their ground. But loyalty came at a cost. The streets grew bloodier. Families mourned sons lost in shootouts. Daughters carried the grief of fathers who never came home. Harlem's nights echoed with sirens. Its mornings opened with headlines about more violence, more bodies. The numbers game was no longer just a gamble. It was a war tax, paid in blood. Stephanie herself became a target more than ever. Schultz's men stalked her movements, watched her cars, studied her routines. There were whispers of assassination plots, of traps being set. But she refused to hide. She walked Harlem's streets draped in diamonds, her head held high, as if daring Schultz to come for her. To many, it seemed reckless. To Harlem, it was heroic. She became a living symbol of defiance, a queen standing tall while the kingdom burned. And the kingdom did burn. One clash erupted outside a candy store, bullets tearing through jars of sweets, glass exploding onto the sidewalk. Another unfolded in a barber shop, razors and scissors clattering to the floor as men ducked for cover. Harlem became a chessboard stained with blood, every corner a contested square. Schultz moved his pieces with violence. Stephanie moved hers with discipline. But every move cost lives. The police were not saviors. Many were already bought, their loyalty sold to Schultz in exchange for envelopes of cash. Raids focused more on independent bankers than on Schultz's men. Honest officers were rare, and even they struggled against the tide of corruption. Harlem knew it couldn't count on the law. Its only defense was itself, and so the community resisted. Ordinary people played their part. Some hid runners in their basements during raids. Others passed information quietly, warning Stephanie's network of Schultz's movements. Women tucked slips into laundry baskets. Children carried bets disguised as school papers. Harlem became an underground army, unarmed but defiant, determined to protect what was theirs. But Schultz was relentless. He poured more men into Harlem, more money into bribes, more bullets into bodies. His goal was absolute control. No compromises. No shared territory. He wanted Harlem broken, its bankers silenced, its queen erased. Stephanie responded with her own weapons. Her ads in the newspapers grew sharper, mocking Schultz, ridiculing his violence, exposing his corruption. She painted him as an outsider, a parasite leeching off Harlem's lifeblood. Her words stung because they were true, and truth, when spoken loudly enough, can be as deadly as any gun. Still, Harlem streets told a harsher story. Children grew up stepping over bloodstains. Families learned to sleep through the sound of gunfire. The Renaissance glow that once defined Harlem dimmed beneath the shadow of constant violence. Art and music still thrived, but now they existed alongside funerals and fear. Harlem was still alive, but scarred. And Stephanie was scarred too. She carried the weight of every life lost under her banner. Every family left grieving because they chose loyalty to her over surrender to Schultz. She knew her defiance had consequences, but surrender was not an option. To give in would mean the death of Harlem's independence, the erasure of everything she had built. Better to fight and bleed than to bow and disappear. The Harlem numbers war raged on, a conflict as much about pride as about money. Schultz brought mafia brutality, police corruption, and overwhelming force. Stephanie brought discipline, loyalty, and the stubborn defiance of a woman who had refused to bow her entire life. The clash was inevitable, its cost incalculable, its outcome uncertain. And in the middle of it all, Harlem waited. Waited for the next shot, the next raid, the next headline. Waited to see if its queen could withstand the storm, or if the Bronx butcher would finally claim his crown. The bullets kept flying, the bodies kept falling, and the war was far from over. Chapter 15. A Woman Who Wouldn't Bow. The headline was ordinary, but the page was not. There, in bold letters and sharp language, Harlem's queen threw her gauntlet down in public for all of New York to see. An entire newspaper page, bought and paid for by Stephanie St. Clair, mocking Dutch Schultz, exposing corrupt cops, and daring anyone, mobster or lawman, to silence her. It wasn't just an ad. It was a declaration of war, written in ink that dripped with defiance. Imagine the reaction. Harlem's readers stopped in their tracks, eyes wide as they read line after line. She wasn't hiding her fury in whispers or backroom speeches. She was naming names, accusing officers of extortion, ridiculing Schultz as a thug too cowardly to face her openly. In a world where gangsters usually operated in shadows, Stephanie had dragged the fight into the daylight. And daylight burned. The ads were sharp, cutting, laced with wit as much as venom. She mocked Schultz's greed, calling him an invader who leached off Harlem's lifeblood. She accused police of being nothing more than hired muscle for gangsters, their badges tarnished by bribes. She wrote with the confidence of a ruler addressing her subjects, reminding Harlem that she was their protector, their queen, the one voice unafraid to say what everyone else only dared to whisper. It was reckless, it was fearless, and it was unforgettable. For Harlem's people, the ads were electrifying. They passed newspapers from hand to hand, reading the words aloud on stoops and in barbershops, cheering her defiance. In a neighborhood crushed by corruption, her words were oxygen. She gave voice to their rage, their frustration, their refusal to be erased. Every ad was a spark of pride, a reminder that Harlem belonged to Harlem. But for Schultz, the ads were humiliation. He was a man who ruled by fear, a gangster who silenced critics with bullets. And here was Stephanie, a woman he dismissed as insignificant, ridiculing him in print. She turned his violence into farce, his empire into a punchline. Every word stripped away the power he wielded through terror. The Bronx butcher, the feared Mafia enforcer, reduced to a target of mockery by a black woman with sharper wit than any blade. His rage was volcanic. He wanted her silenced, erased, buried so deep that her name would never echo again. But killing her was complicated. She was too visible, too beloved by Harlem. To strike her openly risked backlash. To let her live meant enduring the sting of her words. She had cornered him with ink in a way no bullet ever had. The police were no less furious. To be accused so boldly in print was an insult they could not swallow. Officers who had long grown fat off Harlem's bribes now found their names whispered with shame. Their corruption, once hidden in shadows, was plastered across pages for all of Harlem to see. And they hated her for it. Every raid, every beating, every moment of harassment against her people was laced with the bitter taste of revenge. But Stephanie didn't stop. Week after week, her ads returned, each one sharper than the last. She knew the danger. She knew she was taunting men who killed without hesitation. But she also knew silence was surrender, and surrender was not in her blood. Her ads became more than just attacks. They became symbols. Each page was a banner Harlem could rally behind, proof that they were not powerless, that someone was willing to fight openly on their behalf. She turned newspapers into battlefields, her words into weapons. Where Schultz used guns, she used language. Where police used clubs, she used truth. And somehow, truth was cutting deeper. Still, the risk was real. Every time she signed her name to an ad, she was daring her enemies to come for her. Friends begged her to stop, to keep quiet, to protect herself. But Stephanie was not fighting only for herself. She was fighting for Harlem's independence, for the dignity of her people, for the right to live without bowing to corruption. To stop would mean betraying everything she had built. And so she kept writing. Her defiance made her a legend, but it also isolated her. She carried the weight of Harlem's pride on her shoulders, knowing that if she faltered, the community would suffer. Nights grew tense. Whispers of plots reached her ears. Rumors of assassins, of police raids designed to crush her once and for all. Yet she still walked Harlem's streets draped in diamonds, head high, her very presence another advertisement of defiance. The contrast between her and Schultz was striking. He ruled with fists, with fear, with bodies dumped in alleys. She ruled with trust, with loyalty, with words that made people believe Harlem could stand tall. It was not just a clash of empires. It was a clash of philosophies. Fear versus respect. Greed versus dignity. Silence versus defiance. And Harlem, caught between them, chose to rally behind the queen. But support could not shield her from danger forever. The Mafia was patient, ruthless, calculating. Schultz's humiliation would not be tolerated indefinitely. Corrupt police officers sharpened their knives, plotting ways to destroy the woman who had exposed them. The walls were closing in. One evening, After yet another ad ridiculed Schultz in print, Stephanie received a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was crude, the message simple: "Stop or die." She read it, folded it carefully, and set it aside without flinching. Fear was exactly what they wanted, and she would not give it to them. But as Harlem's nights grew darker, and the Mafia shadows stretched further uptown, even Stephanie must have wondered how long Defiance alone could protect her. The ink was still drying on her latest ad when whispers began spreading that Schultz had finally made his decision. The Harlem Queen had mocked him long enough. The stage was set. The question was no longer if he would strike. It was when. Chapter 16, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson appears. The fight for Harlem had reached a boiling point. Gunfire echoed off the brick walls, and Dutch Schultz's men stalked the avenues like wolves. It seemed inevitable that Harlem's independence would crack under the pressure. But in the shadows of that chaos, a young man was watching. His head was full of ambition, his fists hardened by the streets, and his mind sharper than most gave him credit for. His name was Ellsworth Johnson, but Harlem would come and know him as Bumpy. He earned that nickname early, the result of a bump on the back of his head he carried since childhood. But in Harlem, nicknames had weight. They weren't just casual labels. They became identities, reputations, warnings. And Bumpy wore his like a badge, transforming what might have been a schoolyard insult into a name that would one day command both fear and respect. Bumpy Johnson grew up in South Carolina, born into a world where Jim Crow's shadow darkened every corner. He was quick to anger, quicker to fight, a boy who refused to bow even when punishment followed. His family, worried his temper would get him killed, sent him north to Harlem when he was still young. Harlem was supposed to offer opportunity. Instead, it threw him into the fire. By the time he reached his 20s, Bumpy had learned the rules of the streets. He could fight, yes, but more importantly, he could think. He studied men the way others studied books. He knew who could be bought, who could be trusted, and who would betray you for a nickel. His fists earned him respect, but his brain kept him alive. When Harlem descended into war under Schultz's invasion, Bumpy saw his chance. He wasn't content to be another runner, another anonymous soldier in someone else's empire. He wanted more. He wanted to stand beside power, not beneath it. And he found his path in the orbit of Harlem's queen. Stephanie St. Clair recognized something in him. She had always been a keen judge of character, and she saw in Bumpy a rare blend of loyalty, intelligence, and ruthless ambition. Where other young men lost themselves to the chaos of the streets, Bumpy moved through it with purpose. She took him under her wing, not as an equal yet, but as a lieutenant. Someone who could carry out her will, protect her empire, and extend her reach when the walls closed in. Bumpy became her sword. In a world where Schultz's men relied on brute force, Bumpy countered with strategy. He organized crews, trained them to resist intimidation, and responded to violence with violence of his own. If Schultz's men threatened collectors, Bumpy threatened back. If they drew blood, he returned it in kind. He was not reckless. He was calculated. And Harlem soon learned that working for Madame St. Clair meant having Bumpy Johnson at your back. His presence changed the balance of power. Stephanie had always been a figure of dignity, a queen draped in silks and diamonds, commanding respect through fairness and authority. But even queens need generals. Bumpy was that general. His fist spoke when words failed. His gun barked when peace was no longer possible. Together, they formed a partnership that terrified enemies and inspired loyalty. But Bumpy was more than muscle. He understood the game. He studied the numbers racket with the same intensity Stephanie had years before. He saw how bets flowed, how profits were stacked, how corruption twisted the system. He absorbed Stephanie's lessons in discipline and respect, realizing that trust was as powerful as fear. He was ambitious, yes, but he was also loyal. For now, his loyalty was to her. That loyalty made him dangerous to Schultz. One night, when Schultz's men attempted to hijack one of Stephanie's collections, it was Bumpy who intervened. He and his crew ambushed the hijackers, sending them scrambling back to the Bronx battered and bloodied. Word spread quickly. Madame St. Clair was not fighting alone anymore. She had soldiers. She had muscle. She had Bumpy. The community noticed too. Harlem's people, already inspired by Stephanie's defiance, now had a new figure to admire. Bumpy walked the streets with confidence, his reputation growing with every clash. He was younger, closer to the ground than the Queen herself, and his presence reassured Harlem that their fight had teeth. But the rise of Bumpy Johnson also introduced tension. Ambition is a fire that never goes out, and even as he fought fiercely for Stephanie, whispers began. Could a man like Bumpy ever be content in someone else's shadow? Was he destined to rule Harlem himself one day? Stephanie surely saw it too, but she was no fool. She knew ambition when she saw it, and she understood that keeping Bumpy close was better than letting him drift. Better to guide his fire than risk being burned by it later. And for now, his loyalty held. Together, they formed a force Schultz could not ignore. Still, Schultz was not easily rattled. He had the Mafia at his back, money pouring into his empire, and police bought by the handful. But Harlem's resistance, sharpened by Bumpy's arrival, was stronger than he anticipated. Every attempt to break the Queen's network was met with counterattacks. Every show of force answered with defiance. Schultz had expected Harlem to fold quickly. Instead, it was bleeding him slowly. The numbers war dragged on, its casualties mounting, its stakes growing. Harlem had become a war zone of shootouts and ambushes, with Stephanie St. Clair's name shining defiantly above it all and Bumpy Johnson's fists and gunfire enforcing her reign. But power is a delicate thing. It shifts, it bends, it tempts. Bumpy's loyalty was genuine, but his ambition was undeniable. Harlem was watching him rise, and some were already whispering that one day the Queen's crown might sit on his head. For now, though, he remained her lieutenant, her soldier, her weapon against the Mafia's encroachment. His presence gave Harlem hope, gave the Queen strength, gave Schultz headaches. Yet as the war dragged on, one truth became clear. Stephanie's fight was no longer hers alone. It was Harlem's fight, and now it was Bumpy's fight too. But wars are never kind to their generals. And in the blood-soaked streets of Harlem, loyalty and ambition rarely survive side by side. Chapter 17. Partnership of Trust. The gunfire ended as quickly as it began, leaving only silence and the acrid bite of smoke in the air. A car sped off into the night, its tires shrieking, leaving two of Schultz's men bleeding on the sidewalk. From the shadows, another figure stepped forward, calm amid the chaos. Bumpy Johnson holstered his pistol and nodded once toward the woman who had trusted him with Harlem's defense. Stephanie St. Clair met his eyes, and in that moment, without a single word, a pact was sealed. Their fight was no longer hers alone. It was theirs. Harlem had always thrived on rhythm. The rhythm of jazz, of sermons, of conversations spilling across stoops and sidewalks. But now its rhythm was war. Schultz's campaign of terror beat down on the neighborhood like a drum of intimidation, and for many, it felt unstoppable. Yet Harlem was not kneeling. Not while the Queen and her lieutenant fought side by side. Their partnership was not born of convenience. It was born of necessity. Stephanie understood that her empire, disciplined and loyal as it was, could not survive Mafia violence on dignity alone. She needed muscle, strategy, someone who could meet Schultz's brutality without tainting her crown. Bumpy understood that his ambition required a cause greater than himself, a throne worth defending, a leader who would sharpen him instead of discard him. Together, they became the iron and the flame, each tempering the other, each amplifying the other's strength. It worked because they trusted each other. Stephanie trusted Bumpy's fists, his instincts, his ability to walk into the smoke of Harlem's battles and return alive. Bumpy trusted her wisdom, her discipline, her vision that Harlem's independence mattered more than quick money or short-lived power. She gave him structure. He gave her fire. Together, they built a balance that neither could have held alone. Their alliance reshaped the streets. Collectors who once walked in fear now carried themselves with renewed confidence. knowing that behind them stood not only the Queen's promise but Bumpy's protection. Schultz's men learned quickly that Harlem was not as easy to swallow as the Bronx. Every ambush met resistance. Every threat carried risk. The Mafia's shadow pressed in, but Harlem pushed back harder than anyone expected. Yet their trust was not blind. Stephanie knew Bumpy's ambition burned hot. She saw in the way he carried himself, in the glint of pride in his eyes when people whispered his name. And Bumpy knew Stephanie's pride could sometimes tilt into stubbornness, daring enemies in ways that invited danger. But instead of letting those flaws divide them, they folded them into their partnership. Bumpy tempered her stubbornness with strategy. She tempered his ambition with discipline. It was not perfect, but it was powerful. For Harlem, their unity was salvation. Together, they defended the numbers racket as not just a business but a symbol of independence. Schultz wanted control. The Mafia wanted profit. But Stephanie and Bumpy fought for something deeper. They fought to prove Harlem could not be conquered. That even in a city built on corruption, one neighborhood could stand tall and claim its own dignity. The community felt that defiance. People whispered about the Queen and her lieutenant, as if they were characters from legend, figures larger than life. Stephanie and her diamonds, Bumpy with his fists, two sides of the same coin, standing against forces that seemed impossible to resist. Harlem rallied, not just with bets and coins, but with loyalty, with courage, with quiet acts of resistance. But war never comes without scars. Bodies continue to fall. Families continue to grieve. Every victory was paid for in blood. And the deeper the fight went, the clearer it became that their partnership was not just about running numbers anymore. It was about survival, of Harlem, of its culture, of the Queen herself. Their enemies noticed too. Schultz fumed at their defiance, his empire bleeding each time Bumpy struck back. Corrupt cops cursed each new ad Stephanie published, her words tearing away at their authority. And the Mafia watched, calculating, weighing whether Harlem was worth the price of war. Through it all, Stephanie and Bumpy leaned on trust. She gave him authority when others would have clipped his wings. He gave her loyalty when others would have seized her crown. Their partnership was a delicate balance, but in the crucible of Harlem's war, it held firm. Yet even trust has limits. As Bumpy's name grew, so did the whispers. Some said he was destined to inherit Harlem, that his ambition would one day clash with Stephanie's pride. Others said their unity was too strong to break, that together they were unstoppable. Harlem watched, waited, wondered. For now, they were allies. But in the underworld, alliances are fragile, as fleeting as smoke rising from a gun barrel. One night, after another bloody skirmish left Schultz's men retreating, Stephanie and Bumpy sat in silence, the weight of their war heavy between them. They didn't need words to know what the other was thinking. This fight was far from over. The Mafia would not retreat forever. The police would not forgive her defiance. And sooner or later, someone would try to break the trust that bound them together. The Harlem Queen had found her general, and Harlem had found its defenders. But in a city where loyalty and betrayal often danced too close together, one question lingered like smoke in the air. How long could trust hold before ambition, or vengeance, tore it apart? Chapter 18, Schultz's enemies multiply. The door slammed shut behind him, and the room grew colder. Dutch Schultz had walked into a meeting he couldn't control, surrounded by men who smiled with their mouths, but measured his every move with calculating eyes. The Commission, New York's governing body of organized crime, had summoned him, and when the Mafia called, you listened. Schultz might have been feared on the streets, but here, in this smoke-thick room of bosses, his power meant less. This was not Harlem, not the Bronx. This was the table where empires lived and died. By the mid-1930s, Schultz had made too many enemies. His Harlem campaign had drained resources and drawn heat. His temper, unpredictable and violent, had alienated allies who once tolerated him. And worst of all, his greed had pushed him into dangerous territory. Schultz was not a man who believed in limits. He wanted more, always more. But in the world of organized crime, Even ambition has boundaries. At the heart of his conflict was money. The Mafia had structured its empire with discipline, carving up territories, cutting profits into shares, enforcing order like a corporation of crime. But Schultz was chaos. He refused to bow to rules, refused to share Harlem's profits, refused to respect boundaries. He treated the numbers racket as his personal kingdom, ignoring that the commission viewed Harlem as theirs to claim when they chose. His arrogance bled into politics as well. When federal prosecutors circled him on tax evasion charges, Schultz made a reckless proposal: kill the prosecutor. His target was Thomas Dewey, a rising star determined to bring gangsters to justice. Schultz argued that eliminating Dewey was the only way to survive. But the commission disagreed. Killing a prosecutor of Dewey's stature would unleash too much heat, too much risk, too much attention. The Mafia preferred profit without chaos. Schultz preferred chaos without restraint. And so the rift deepened. Around the commission table, powerful men exchanged glances. Lucky Luciano, ever pragmatic, saw Schultz as a liability. Frank Costello, calm and calculating, worried about stability. Even men who once allied with Schultz now whispered against him. His violence, once an asset, was now a danger. His refusal to bend to order made him a wild card in a world built on balance. Meanwhile, Schultz's war in Harlem dragged on, bleeding resources and drawing headlines. Every gunfight, every body left in the gutter, brought unwanted attention. Politicians grew restless. Police, even those bought by bribes, felt the pressure to act. Harlem was no longer just a profitable racket. It had become a symbol of Schultz's recklessness. And symbols, in the Mafia's world, could not be tolerated if they threatened the greater empire. Schultz felt the walls closing in. His paranoia grew, his temper sharper. He lashed out at rivals, barked at allies, demanded loyalty from men who increasingly wondered if their futures would be safer without him. He believed his violence made him untouchable, but in truth, it had only made him predictable. And predictability is dangerous when surrounded by men who thrive on calculation. For Harlem, Schultz's weakness was both blessing and curse. On one hand, his distractions gave Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson breathing room, space to tighten their defenses and rally the community. On the other, his desperation made him more dangerous. A corner animal bites hardest, and Schultz was cornered. His enemies multiplied not just in Harlem, but across New York. Politicians despised him. Prosecutors hunted him. The commission plotted against him. And Harlem resisted him. He was a man surrounded, his empire crumbling at the edges, his pride blinding him to the inevitable. One evening, Schultz ranted to his men about Dewey, about Harlem, about the commission. His voice shook with fury, his words dripping with paranoia. He believed he could still win, still crush Harlem, still silence Dewey, still bend the commission to his will. But the men around him knew better. They heard the desperation in his tone, the cracks in his confidence, and they knew the commission would not wait much longer. The bosses of New York had tolerated Schultz long enough. His time was running out. Back in Harlem, Stephanie watched the shift with cold clarity. She had always known Schultz's brutality carried the seeds of his downfall. Fear can control for a time, but it cannot inspire loyalty. And without loyalty, power rots from within. She saw the cracks forming in his empire, the hesitation of his men, the whispers of betrayal. For her, it was vindication. Harlem had resisted, and now Schultz was bleeding. But she also knew danger had not passed. A wounded man is most volatile, most reckless. Schultz could still strike, could still spill blood in one final attempt to salvage his pride. Harlem braced itself, uncertain whether the storm was breaking or about to grow worse. The commission deliberated quietly, carefully. They weighed the risks, the profits, the chaos. And one by one, the bosses came to the same conclusion. Dutch Schultz had outlived his usefulness. His violence threatened their stability. His ambition threatened their order. His recklessness threatened their survival. In the world of organized crime, such men do not retire. They are erased. And so, While Schultz plotted to kill a prosecutor, while he raged about Harlem, while he clung to the crumbling edges of his empire, the commission made its decision. The Bronx butcher's fate was sealed. But when the blade falls, it never falls quietly. Chapter 19. The Fall of Dutch Schultz. The restaurant was quiet that night, its booths filled with low conversation and the smell of roast meat clinging to the air. Dutch Schultz sat at a corner table, his glass sweating against the white cloth, his eyes darting between the door and the men who had followed him inside. He was restless, paranoid, a man who had felt the tide turning against him but refused to believe it. The commission had made its decision. He just didn't know the executioner was already in the room. It was October of 1935, and Schultz was living on borrowed time. His obsession with killing prosecutor Thomas Dewey had sealed his fate. The bosses had tolerated his violence, his chaos, even his Harlem War, but targeting a federal prosecutor threatened the entire underworld. The commission didn't forgive recklessness when it endangered profits. Dutch Schultz, once the butcher of the Bronx, was now a liability. His enemies had multiplied, and betrayal was circling like vultures over a carcass. Harlem despised him. Politicians wanted him buried. The Mafia bosses wanted him erased. Only Schultz seemed blind to the inevitability. He still thought he could claw his way back, that fear and bullets would save him as they always had. But fear doesn't work on men who have already decided you're dead. That night at the Palace Chop House in Newark, he drank with his crew, pretending all was normal. He bragged. He laughed too loudly. He barked orders as if the empire he once commanded was still intact. But beneath the table, his hand trembled. He had grown paranoid, carrying pistols everywhere, moving constantly, convinced assassins stalked him. Ironically, it was his paranoia that had driven him to Newark, hoping the distance would shield him from Mafia eyes. But Mafia eyes were everywhere. The hit came fast, quiet, and merciless. Men slipped in carrying pistols wrapped in towels to muffle the sound. They walked past diners as if they belonged there. Then, without hesitation, they opened fire. Bullets tore through the room, glass shattered, bodies crumpled. Schultz was hit in the stomach, the force of it slamming him back, his glass spilling red across the white tablecloth. His crew fell beside him, some dead instantly, others groaning in pain. Chaos erupted, screams filling the restaurant as the gunman turned and vanished into the night. Schultz didn't die right away. He clung to life with the same stubbornness that had carried him from Bronx gutters to Mafia meetings. Rushed to the hospital, he raved deliriously, muttering nonsense, cursing enemies, rambling about numbers and betrayals. For hours, doctors fought to keep him alive, bullets lodged deep in his body. But even Dutch Schultz couldn't outfight death. After nearly a day of agony, his body finally gave out. And just like that, Harlem's nightmare ended. News of his death spread quickly. Harlem exhaled a breath it had been holding for years. Shopkeepers whispered relief. Collectors walked with straighter backs. Families prayed in gratitude. The Bronx butcher was gone, and with him, his relentless campaign to steal Harlem's independence. For Stephanie St. Clair, it was vindication. She had defied him, mocked him, resisted him when others surrendered. She had watched her people bleed, watched her empire threatened, and still she had not bowed. Schultz's death was not her doing, but it was her victory all the same. Harlem remained unbroken, and the Queen still stood. But Harlem knew better than to celebrate too loudly. Schultz's fall didn't mean the war was over. The Mafia wasn't gone. Luciano, Costello, and others still circled, still hungry for Harlem's profits. Schultz's death removed one threat, but it opened the door for others. Harlem's independence was fragile, its queen still surrounded by enemies who saw opportunity in her defiance. Still, for one fleeting moment, Harlem savored the silence. The gunfire that had scarred its nights seemed distant. The shadow Schultz had cast over its streets lifted. The Queen walked proudly through Lenox Avenue, her head high, her diamonds flashing, her people greeting her not just with admiration, but with relief. Harlem had survived Dutch Schultz, yet survival in the underworld is never final. Victories are temporary, crowns always contested. Schultz's fall had shifted the balance of power, but it had not erased the Mafia's ambitions. And as Harlem celebrated, in the backrooms of New York, new plans were already being drawn. Because when one predator falls, another always steps forward. And Harlem's queen was about to face the next. Chapter 20. The Transition of Power. The throne was never empty for long. Dutch Schultz's body was barely cold when whispers began. Who would claim Harlem now? Power does not vanish when a king falls. It shifts. It searches for a new vessel. And in the tense quiet after Schultz's assassination in 1935, Harlem's underworld turned its eyes toward a young man who had been waiting in the wings. His name was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. It didn't happen overnight. Harlem was too fractured, too bloodied, too weary from years of Schultz's campaign to simply accept a new ruler. But Bumpy understood something others didn't. Power is not seized all at once. It is taken in pieces, earned, tested, cemented with loyalty. He knew Harlem wouldn't kneel to another invader, not after what Schultz had done. So he positioned himself not as a conqueror, but as a protector. And Harlem, still bruised, still proud, responded. Stephanie St. Clair was still the queen. Her words still carried weight. Her defiance still defined Harlem's independence. But she was also pragmatic. She saw the tides turning, saw how the Mafia circled like vultures, saw how Harlem's younger generation looked to Bumpy with awe. And she made a choice. Instead of fighting him, she elevated him. She gave him space to grow, trusted him with responsibility, allowed his reputation to spread under her shadow. It was a partnership at first, a continuation of the trust they had built during Schultz's war. Stephanie remained the figurehead, the public defender of Harlem's dignity, while Bumpy became the muscle and the strategist, the man who dealt with day-to-day battles on the street. Collectors reported to him. Crews followed his orders. When trouble came, it was Bumpy who handled it, while Stephanie maintained her regal distance. Harlem began to shift around that balance. For years, the numbers game had been seen as the queen's domain, her empire carved from trust and respect. But now, people whispered Bumpy's name with the same reverence. He was younger, closer to the ground, a man who walked the same blocks they did, spoke their slang, carried their struggles in his posture. Stephanie was a symbol. Bumpy was a presence. Together, they gave Harlem strength. But ambition never sleeps. As Bumpy's influence grew, so did his ambitions. He didn't just want to enforce Stephanie's rule. He wanted to build something of his own, something lasting. And Harlem, scarred by Schultz but still resilient, seemed ready for a new leader who could stand toe-to-toe with the Mafia's growing presence. Stephanie must have known it. She must have felt the shift, the slow transition of loyalty, the way her crown was being shared, perhaps even replaced. But she didn't resist. She let it happen, guiding Bumpy instead of fighting him. That was her genius. She understood that Harlem needed him. The transition was subtle but steady. When disputes broke out, it was Bumpy who mediated. When rival crews tested Harlem's boundaries, it was Bumpy who answered. His reputation grew with every fight, every negotiation, every quiet act of loyalty to his people. He treated runners with respect, just as Stephanie had taught him, but he also commanded fear when necessary. He was a bridge between the Queen's philosophy of fairness and the Mafia's philosophy of force. Harlem needed both, and so, Bumpy became Harlem's new broker of power. The Mafia noticed. Luciano, Costello, and their associates understood that Harlem could not be controlled by outsiders alone. They needed someone inside, someone who could command loyalty where they could not. Bumpy became that figure, whether by choice or by inevitability. He negotiated, balanced, carved out space where Harlem could survive without being swallowed whole. But those negotiations came at a cost. Aligning with the Mafia meant walking a razor's edge. Too much resistance, and Harlem would face another war. Too much submission, and Harlem would lose its independence. Bumpy walked that line with precision, his loyalty to Harlem tested at every turn. For Stephanie, the transition was bittersweet. She had fought for Harlem with dignity, with wit, with fearlessness. She had mocked Schultz, defied the police, built an empire out of respect. But time moves forward, and the underworld is not kind to symbols alone. Harlem was changing. Its streets demanded a new kind of leader, one who could fight with fists as well as words. And Bumpy was that leader. Still, she did not fade into silence. She remained the queen, her presence a constant reminder of Harlem's defiance, her voice sharp whenever corruption reared its head. But the day-to-day reign of Harlem's underworld was no longer hers. It belonged to the man she had once taken under her wing, the boy with a bump on his head who had grown into Harlem's king. The transition of power was not a betrayal. It was survival. Harlem could not stand against the Mafia without a strong figure to anchor it, and Stephanie had chosen wisely. Her crown, though not passed formally, rested now on Bumpy's head. Yet crowns are heavy things. The more power Bumpy held, the more dangerous his life became. The Mafia's expectations grew. Harlem's reliance deepened. Every decision carried consequences. Every alliance risked betrayal. And though Bumpy carried himself with confidence, he must have felt a weight pressing down. He was no longer just a lieutenant. He was the man who stood between Harlem and submission. The queen had chosen her successor. Harlem had found its protector. But the war for independence was far from over. Because the Mafia was not done, and sooner or later, Harlem's new king would be tested in ways even Stephanie had never faced. Chapter 21. Retreat from the Spotlight. The street outside the Lafayette Theater still buzzed with music, laughter, and cigarette smoke when she stepped out into the Harlem night. For years, every head would turn at the sight of her, her jewels flashing under the lamps, her gowns trailing like banners of victory, her presence commanding silence. But on this night, fewer heads turned. The applause belonged to someone else now. Stephanie St. Clair walked with the same pride as ever, but the weight in her steps was heavier. She knew it was time. The Queen of Harlem had fought her battles, mocked the police, defied Dutch Schultz, and ruled an empire carved out of respect. But empires shift, and Harlem was changing. The numbers racket, once the heartbeat of the community, had grown more dangerous, tangled tighter with the Mafia's grasp. Bumpy Johnson was rising, and Harlem was rallying behind him. Stephanie, sharp-eyed as always, recognized what so many leaders fail to admit. Power must be passed before it rots. Her retreat from the spotlight wasn't dramatic. There was no grand announcement, no surrender. It was quiet, deliberate, the kind of transition only those closest to her could see. She began stepping back from daily collections, leaving the street wars to Bumpy. Meetings once led by her voice were now steered by his. Crews who once reported only to the Queen found themselves following his orders. It was not weakness. It was wisdom. For years, Stephanie had built her empire on loyalty and fairness. Those foundations remained, but her age and her battles had taken their toll. She had seen enough funerals, enough blood on Harlem sidewalks, enough betrayal wrapped in smiles. The underworld demanded constant vigilance, constant performance, constant readiness to strike or defend. And for the first time, she allowed herself to admit what she had always denied. She was tired. Not defeated, never defeated, just tired. Bumpy filled the void with ease. He carried Harlem's struggles in his stride, his ambition burning hot enough to light every dark corner Schultz had once stained. He was young, fearless, and hungry, the kind of leader Harlem's new generation could rally behind. And Stephanie, far from bitter, allowed it. She had trained him, sharpened him, molded him into the man Harlem needed. His rise was, in some ways, her victory. Still, stepping back was not easy. For a woman who had fought her way from Martinique's poverty to Harlem's crown, the spotlight had never been just a luxury. It was proof of survival. Every jewel she wore, every ad she published, every act of defiance had been carved from the world's refusal to acknowledge her worth. To retreat meant surrendering that constant reminder. But she chose to retreat on her own terms, before time or enemies forced her hand. Harlem noticed. The Queen still walked its avenues, still appeared at salons and clubs, still draped herself in finery that whispered of power. But the whispers now carried another name, Bumpy's. People spoke of his muscle, his negotiations, his ability to balance Harlem's independence with the Mafia's looming presence. Stephanie was still respected, still revered. But respect no longer meant control. She accepted it with grace, though perhaps not without private regret. Power, once tasted, never leaves the blood. She had lived as a symbol, a ruler, a fighter, and now she had to learn how to live as something else. Retreating didn't erase her crown. It simply changed its meaning. She was no longer Harlem's day-to-day commander. She was Harlem's memory, its reminder of dignity, its proof that independence could be won. Behind closed doors, she continued to advise Bumpy. Their trust remained intact, though the balance had shifted. He came to her for counsel, for strategy, for wisdom drawn from battles she had already fought. She gave freely, knowing that Harlem's survival depended on his success. Her pride was not in clinging to her crown, but in ensuring it passed to hands capable of carrying it. Yet the underworld does not always respect smooth transitions. To outsiders, Stephanie's retreat looked like weakness. Rivals whispered that the Queen was fading, that her time had ended, that Harlem's independence might finally be vulnerable. The Mafia watched too, calculating how much control Bumpy truly had, whether Harlem could be bent to their will with its Queen stepping into the shadows. And Stephanie must have known that retreating carried its own dangers. A throne left empty invites challengers. Even if Bumpy sat upon it, his youth made him a target. She had survived long enough to understand that leadership is not inherited, it is constantly tested. Her withdrawal gave him space, but it also painted him as the man to beat. Still, she did not waver. She walked Harlem's streets less frequently, but when she did, she carried herself with the same regal defiance, as if to remind the city that she was not gone. She attended gatherings, her presence still magnetic, though now she often stood at the edge instead of the center. It was a slow dimming, like the setting sun casting its last glow before night. For Harlem, it was bittersweet. The Queen who had defied Schultz, who had stared down police corruption, who had carried their pride through the darkest years, was stepping back. But Harlem also knew it needed Bumpy's fire, his fists, his ambition. The neighborhood was not mourning a loss. It was adjusting to a new chapter. And in that chapter, Stephanie still mattered. She remained the conscience of Harlem's underworld, a reminder that power meant responsibility, that leadership meant protecting the community, not just exploiting it. Bumpy carried her lessons with him, his rise shaped by her teachings. The Queen's retreat was not erasure, it was legacy. But even legacies are fragile. As Bumpy's star rose, Stephanie's enemies still lingered. The Mafia had not abandoned Harlem. Corrupt cops still resented her, their hatred of her ads not forgotten. Politicians still viewed her as a threat, even in retreat. Her withdrawal gave her peace, but peace was always temporary in a city built on betrayal. And so, as Harlem adjusted to its new balance, questions lingered. Could Bumpy hold the crown against the Mafia's pressure? Could Stephanie truly find peace in retreat? Or would the world drag her back in a battle she thought she had left behind? For now, the Queen had stepped into the shadows, allowing her general to reign. But shadows are dangerous places, and Harlem's story was far from over. Chapter 22, Political Advocacy. The typewriter keys struck like gunfire in the quiet of her apartment. Each letter was sharp, deliberate, a bullet aimed at corruption, at racism, at the hypocrisy of a system that had long tried to silence her. She was no longer on the streets, no longer collecting slips or sending crews into battle. But Stephanie St. Clair was not finished fighting. Her battleground had simply changed. Now, the war was waged on paper. In her later years, the Queen of Harlem transformed herself into something more than an underworld figure. She became an advocate, a writer, a critic of the very system that had hounded her for decades. With her empire passed into Bumpy Johnson's hands, Stephanie poured her fire into words, publishing letters and articles that called out police brutality, denounced racial injustice, and exposed the corruption that bled Harlem dry. She understood that power wasn't only measured in guns and money. It was measured in truth, and truth, when written boldly enough, could shake the ground beneath powerful men. Her letters were sharp, fearless, unmistakably hers. She accused police officers of extorting Harlem's people, of harassing citizens who had little defense. She mocked politicians who promised progress, but delivered only oppression. She wrote about the dignity of Harlem's community, the right of black men and women to live without being preyed upon by the very institutions meant to protect them. For many in Harlem, her words were as powerful as her diamonds once were. They were proof that even off the battlefield of racketeering, their queen still stood with them. She had not abandoned Harlem. She had simply changed weapons. Her writing carried the same wit, the same biting edge that once ridiculed Dutch Schultz in newspaper ads. She was older now, her body weary, but her mind was sharper than ever. She refused to let Harlem be reduced to caricatures in the press, refused to let injustice go unanswered. When others bowed to pressure, Stephanie doubled down. Her pen did not tremble, but writing brought its own dangers. Police officers despised her for dragging their corruption into daylight. Politicians fumed at her audacity, the way she spoke truths they spent careers trying to bury. Even allies worried her boldness might provoke retaliation. Yet Stephanie did not stop. She had never lived quietly, and she would not end quietly. Her later years became a different kind of legend. The queen who once ruled Harlem's numbers game now ruled the pages of newspapers, her voice echoing in salons, barbershops, and church basements. People read her words aloud, nodding, murmuring agreement, sometimes cheering. She was no longer just a symbol of resistance in Harlem's underworld. She was a defender of Harlem's soul. And still, the defiance carried weight. She had survived the Mafia, survived corrupt cops, survived the endless battles of the streets. But the fight for justice was bigger than any numbers racket. Racism was not a rival that could be gunned down in an alley. Corruption was not a single enemy that could be mocked into retreat. These were shadows woven into the very fabric of the city, and Stephanie faced them with the same stubborn pride she had always carried. Her enemies did not forget. Even in retreat, her name was cursed in precinct houses, her words mocked in political offices. But the people remembered too. To Harlem, she was still the queen, not because she ran rackets, but because she never bowed. There must have been moments, late at night, when she wondered what it all meant. The diamonds, the battles, the years of defiance, did they add up to victory or just survival? Yet even in those quiet hours, she refused regret. She had lived on her own terms, fought on her own terms, and now, in the twilight of her life, she was speaking on her own terms. Few could claim the same. Her letters did more than criticize. They inspired. They reminded Harlem's younger generation that resistance was possible, that dignity was worth defending, that silence was complicity. She had once fought for Harlem's independence in the underworld. Now she fought for its respect in the eyes of history. But history is never simple. Her past as a numbers queen lingered, coloring how outsiders viewed her advocacy. Some dismissed her as a criminal, unworthy of being heard. Others pointed to her survival as proof she understood power better than most. She was both outlaw and activist, sinner and saint, a woman whose contradictions only made her legend grow. In Harlem, those contradictions didn't matter. What mattered was that she had never abandoned them. Even as the spotlight dimmed, even as younger leaders rose, even as her empire shifted into other hands, she still fought. She had started her life in poverty, built an empire in defiance, and ended it writing truths the city needed to hear. Her life was proof that crowns don't always fade. Sometimes they transform. And yet, her retreat into advocacy carried a shadow of uncertainty. She had given the streets to Bumpy Johnson, but the Mafia was still there, still circling, still pressing. Harlem's independence was fragile, its future uncertain. Stephanie's voice was strong, but she could not protect Harlem with words alone. Her later years were a reminder of resilience, but also of fragility. She was no longer untouchable. Age had softened her body, even if her spirit remained unbroken. The enemy she mocked with her pen still had power, still had reach. And the question lingered. Could even Stephanie St. Clair, Harlem's queen, withstand the weight of history forever? The typewriter fell silent. Another letter finished, another truth spoken. She leaned back, her diamonds catching the dim light, her pride intact. Outside, Harlem pulsed with life, its future unwritten, its survival uncertain. She had done her part. She had fought her wars. She had left her words. But in Harlem, the fight never truly ends. Chapter 23, Madame's Reputation. The whispers about her never stopped. In Harlem's bars, on its stoops, in the smoke-filled corners of its clubs, people spoke her name with equal parts awe and suspicion. To some, she was a criminal queen who grew rich off the pennies of the poor. To others, she was a defender of the community, a woman who stood against police corruption, mafia greed, and the cruelty of a city that tried to crush them. Stephanie St. Clair lived in that tension, and it was in that tension that her legend was born. Her reputation was a paradox. She was a woman who could walk into a room draped in jewels worth more than most families would see in a lifetime, and then donate money quietly to a neighbor who couldn't pay rent. She was ruthless to rivals, yet fair to the people who played her numbers. She was feared by gangsters, yet admired by artists and activists. Depending on who you asked, Madame St. Clair was either Harlem's savior or its exploiter. Both images clung to her, inseparable, like two sides of a coin. The newspapers rarely captured the full picture. White-owned presses painted her as an exotic criminal curiosity, a woman out of place in the underworld, her elegance framed as arrogance, her intelligence dismissed as cunning. They called her Madame Queen of Policy, as if the title itself was a joke, a contradiction in terms. But Harlem knew better. Harlem understood that the word policy was not just gambling. It was survival. It was hope. And she had given that hope a face. Still, there were critics. Some argued that she profited off desperation, that the numbers racket preyed on the dreams of the poor. For every bettor who won, dozens lost. For every family lifted by a lucky hit, others sank deeper into poverty. And it was true. Stephanie had grown rich off a system that was not built to make everyone win. She wore silk gowns, rode in fine cars, while Harlem's streets remained hungry. That truth followed her, whispered by those who resented her wealth. But there was another truth, too. Unlike Schultz, unlike the Mafia, Stephanie reinvested in Harlem. She paid her winners honestly, even when it hurt her profits. She funded causes, supported activists, and defended Harlem's dignity in print. She used her wealth not only to display power, but to wield it for her people. That was the difference Harlem never forgot. She may have been a criminal in the eyes of the law, but to many, she was also a shield. Her reputation was shaped as much by perception as by reality. To a young woman walking down Lenox Avenue, seeing Madame St. Clair dressed like royalty was inspiration. It was proof that a black woman could command respect in a world built to deny her. To a numbers bettor whose winnings put food on the table, she was a provider. To a rival banker who crossed her, she was a nightmare. Each perspective was true, each perspective incomplete. She leaned into that contradiction. She cultivated her image carefully, knowing that power depended on how people saw her. The diamonds, the gowns, the sharp ads in newspapers. These were not just personal indulgences. They were armor. They announced that she was untouchable, larger than life, a queen in a city that had crowned very few. Even her enemies had to admit it. She knew how to command attention. But commanding attention came with consequences. Police officers resented her for exposing their corruption, branding her as arrogant. The Mafia viewed her as stubborn, a woman too proud to submit. Even some in Harlem questioned whether her pride would bring more trouble than it was worth. Her reputation made her a symbol, but it also made her a target. Symbols carry burdens. Every time her name appeared in print, it carried weight. For the community, it meant hope. For her enemies, it meant provocation. For Stephanie herself, it meant living under constant scrutiny, balancing her pride with the risk of retaliation. Reputation was both her crown and her chain. She wore it proudly, but she could never take it off. As years passed, her image evolved. The Queen of Harlem, the racketeer, became Madame St. Clair the advocate. Her voice carried through letters and articles denouncing injustice. To some, it was redemption. To others, it was proof that she had always been more than a gangster, that her fight had always been about dignity, not just money. Yet the contradictions never faded. She was both outlaw and activist, both feared and beloved. That complexity is why her legend endures. She was not one thing. She was many. A Caribbean immigrant who carved her way into Harlem's history. A woman who defied gangsters and cops alike. A queen who ruled not with a crown of gold, but with the sharper crown of reputation. And perhaps that was her greatest weapon of all. Because long after the guns fell silent, long after the Mafia tightened its grip on New York, long after the numbers racket faded into memory, people still spoke her name. Not in simple terms, not as a villain or a saint, but as a figure who embodied Harlem's struggle itself. Brilliant, flawed, proud, defiant. Still, the question lingered. What would history remember? The criminal who ran rackets? The queen who defended her people? Or the complicated woman who walked the tightrope between both? For Stephanie St. Clair, reputation was survival. But survival is never guaranteed. And as the years closed in, the Queen of Harlem would learn that even legends must face the silence of time. Chapter 24, Death and Memory. The news barely made a ripple. In a city roaring with protests, assassinations, and upheaval, her death in 1969 passed with little fanfare. No grand obituaries in the major papers. No headlines screaming about the Queen of Harlem's final bow. Stephanie St. Clair, Madam Queen, the woman who had once mocked Dutch Schultz and stared down police corruption, slipped quietly from the world, leaving behind a legend that mainstream history chose to forget. It felt like an injustice. A woman who had once controlled Harlem's most lucrative enterprise, who had defied both the Mafia and the police, who had written letters calling out racism and brutality long before it was fashionable, was laid to rest in relative silence. There were no state funerals, no grand memorials. Just whispers among those who remembered her, fragments of stories retold in Harlem's bars and salons, memories of the queen who once ruled their streets. Her passing marked the end of an era. By the late 1960s, Harlem had changed. The numbers game, once its underground economy, had faded, replaced by new hustles, new vices, new struggles. The Mafia still lingered, but its grip was weakening under federal pressure. Civil rights marches thundered louder than street rackets. The world had shifted, and Stephanie, in her final years, had lived quietly on its margins, her typewriter silent, her diamonds tucked away. Yet those who knew her never forgot the woman she had been. They remembered her walking down Lenox Avenue draped in jewels, her head high as if the streets themselves bent to her. They remembered her fiery ads in newspapers, mocking gangsters and corrupt officers with words as sharp as knives. They remembered her defiance, her pride, her refusal to bow to anyone. She was both myth and memory, but history, as written in textbooks and mainstream accounts, chose to erase her. Perhaps it was easier to dismiss her as just another gangster, another policy queen who profited from Harlem's desperation. Perhaps her gender, her race, her defiance made her inconvenient for a narrative that preferred stories of men. Luciano, Schultz, Capone, while women like Stephanie were pushed to the margins. But Harlem remembered. In whispers, in stories, in fragments of legend, her name endured. Old-timers told children about the queen who once paid her players fairly, who protected the neighborhood when outsiders tried to take it, who never bowed to corrupt cops. For them, she was not just a gangster. She was a symbol of dignity, a reminder that Harlem had always fought back. Her death in 1969 came at a time when America itself was unraveling. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated a year earlier. Malcolm X, once a fiery presence in Harlem, had been gone for 4 years. The civil rights movement was giving way to black power, the streets alive with both pride and anger. Against that backdrop, Stephanie's passing felt like the quiet end of one battle as another raged on. Yet her silence and death mirrored the silence imposed on her life by history. The major papers wrote little. The Mafia's chronicles left her out. The official records treated her as a footnote, if at all. But history's silence cannot erase memory. And in Harlem, her legend lived where it had always belonged, in the mouths and hearts of her people. It is strange how time remembers. Dutch Schultz, violent and reckless, is still studied in books about the Mafia. Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, even Capone, names etched into the mythology of American crime. But Stephanie St. Clair, the woman who defied them all, is left in the shadows. She is a ghost at the edges of history, remembered only by those who look closely, who listen to the whispers of Harlem's past. And maybe that is fitting, because Stephanie never sought the approval of outsiders. She never begged mainstream respect. She built her crown out of defiance, not acceptance. She lived on her own terms, fought on her own terms, and perhaps it was inevitable that her memory, too, would remain independent, cherished only by those who understood what she meant. Still, the silence around her passing raises a haunting question. What does it mean when history forgets its queens? What does it say about the stories we choose to tell and the ones we bury? Stephanie's life was proof that power could come from places the world refused to acknowledge. Her death, quiet and overlooked, was proof of how easily that power could be erased from the official record. But Harlem never forgot, and perhaps that is the truest legacy. Not the headlines, not the history books, but the whispers of a community that still remembered the queen who once walked among them. She was not perfect, she was not saintly, but she was theirs. And in Harlem, that meant everything. Her body was laid to rest, her jewels no longer flashing, her typewriter silent. But her legend, stubborn and unbowed, remained alive in the rhythm of Harlem itself. And as time moved forward, as Harlem changed again and again, her ghost lingered, reminding those who remembered that dignity is worth fighting for, even if history chooses to forget you. But legends, like shadows, never stay buried for long. Chapter 25. A Queen Who Never Bowed. The photograph is grainy, the edges worn, the face regal. A woman draped in furs and jewels, her chin tilted high, her eyes sharp and unyielding. For many who stumble upon the image, she is a mystery, just another name from Harlem's past, forgotten by the broader sweep of history. But for those who know, those who remember, that photograph carries more weight than 1,000 words. It is the face of a queen who never bowed. Stephanie St. Clair's story is not neat. It does not fit comfortably into the categories history prefers. She was not simply a gangster, nor simply an activist, nor simply a woman of wealth. She was all of those things and more, a rare figure who carved a throne in a world that told her she should never exist. Born poor in Martinique, arriving in New York as an immigrant, she clawed her way into power through intellect, discipline, and sheer defiance. She ruled an empire built on numbers, slips, and community trust, staring down corrupt police, battling mobsters, and defending Harlem's independence with every breath. Her life was contradiction. She was both feared and loved, both ruthless and fair. She wore diamonds while the people around her struggled, yet she paid them honestly when others would have cheated. She defied mafia bosses who silenced men twice her size, mocking them in public while they cursed her name in private. She spent her final years denouncing the very corruption that had haunted her entire career. She was not perfect, she was not pure, but she was unforgettable. To call her rare is an understatement. Organized crime, then and now, has been a man's world, a place where violence and greed crown men as kings while women are often erased, reduced to wives or mistresses. Stephanie broke that mold. She ruled openly, proudly, defiantly. She did not hide behind men. She hired them, trained them, led them. She mocked Dutch Schultz, stood toe-to-toe with the Mafia Commission's encroachment, and outlasted enemies who thought her gender and her race made her weak. She proved them wrong, again and again. Her refusal to bow was more than stubborn pride. It was survival. Every ad she placed in the papers, every word she wrote against police corruption, every diamond she wore on Harlem streets was a declaration that she would not be erased. In a city that dismissed black women as invisible, she made herself unforgettable. In a world that demanded silence, she shouted. In a time when power meant submission to men with guns and badges, she carved out her own throne. And yet, mainstream history did not crown her. While Capone became myth, while Luciano became legend, Stephanie was pushed into the shadows, her story left behind in Harlem's whispers. Perhaps it was because she was a woman. Perhaps because she was black. Perhaps because she refused to fit into the neat narrative of the underworld as a playground of men. Whatever the reason, her name faded from the pages of official history. But fading from books does not mean fading from memory. In Harlem, her legend endures. Old-timers still tell of the queen who paid her winners fairly, who mocked the Bronx butcher, who never bowed to corrupt cops. Her name still lingers in the stories of resilience, in the pride of a community that has always had to fight for its dignity. For Harlem, she was more than a policy queen. She was proof. Proof that independence could be defended. Proof that power could come from places the world tried to ignore. Proof that dignity, once claimed, could not be stolen. Her legacy is not measured in money. Her empire crumbled. Her fortune faded. Her jewels tucked away. What remains is something more powerful. The memory of a woman who stood unafraid in a world built to break her. A woman who lived with contradictions, but never with shame. A woman who made history, even if history tried to forget her. Stephanie St. Clair's story forces us to ask difficult questions. What does it mean to be both criminal and defender? To profit off desperation while also protecting dignity? To wear a crown forged from both ruthlessness and fairness? The answers are not simple. But then again, neither was she. What is simple is this: Stephanie St. Clair never bowed. Not to the Mafia. Not to corrupt police. Not to the expectations of society. She lived her life on her own terms, and she died unbroken. Few can claim the same, and maybe that is why her story matters now more than ever. In a world still scarred by corruption, by systemic injustice, by power that exploits the weak, her life reminds us that resistance is possible, that dignity can be defended, that one voice, unafraid, can echo across decades. The Queen of Harlem may not have monuments built in her honor. Her name may not appear in textbooks beside Capone or Luciano, but legends are not measured in monuments. They are measured in memory. And in Harlem, her memory remains. A photograph, a story, a whisper, a legend. Stephanie St. Clair, the queen who never bowed.